Hey, welcome back, friend. If you're new here, hello. I am so glad you found this little corner of the internet where history comes alive one story at a time. Tonight, we're going somewhere might surprise you. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not a grand hall full of knights and kings. Tonight we are stepping into the quiet candlelit rooms where Tudor women were born, raised, and shaped not by laws written on parchment, but by rules that nobody ever wrote down at all. And here's the thing that will keep you thinking tonight in the best possible way. Some of those rules, they will sound shockingly familiar. Picture this. A cold morning in England. 1500 something. A baby is born. The midwife holds a child up, takes one look, and the room goes just slightly quieter than it should. It is a girl, and in that single breath of silence, her life has already been decided. Not by what she will do, not by who she will become, but by the simple fact of her gender. Welcome to Tudor England, where the most powerful rules were never spoken out loud. Now, before we dive in, if this kind of storytelling makes your evenings a little softer and a little harder to stop listening to, go ahead and hit subscribe, leave a like, or drop a comment below, telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Are you already tucked in, sitting by a window somewhere quiet? I genuinely love knowing where these stories find you. Dim those lights just a little. Maybe turn on a soft fan. Let the world outside go quiet. And let me take you somewhere extraordinary. Let us start at the very beginning. And I mean the very, very beginning. In Tudor England, a woman's story did not start when she got married or when she had children. It started the moment she entered the world. And in many households, that moment was already a quiet disappointment. Now I want to be fair. Not every family was cold about welcoming a daughter, but the social and economic pressures of Tudor society were structured in a way that persistently, unmistakably sent one message. A son was wealth. A daughter was expense. Sons inherited land. Sons carried the family name. Sons could hold office, run trades, sit in parliament, join the clergy. Daughters needed a dowry, and then they needed a husband to take them off the family's hands. And then they needed to disappear quietly into his household. That was the plan. That was always the plan. And it started before birth. Here is something that will absolutely stop you mid-breath. The Catholic Church, which governed the spiritual lives of English people for the vast majority of the Tudor period, taught that a male fetus received its soul 40 days after conception. A female fetus 80 days. 40 extra days without a soul. Let that sit for just a moment. Before a girl was even born, before she'd taken her first breath, the most powerful religious institution in the world had already declared that she was in a sense less sacred, less urgent, less fully human in those early weeks of existence. This was not fringe thinking. This was documented theological teaching rooted in the work of Aristotle, absorbed into medieval Catholic doctrine, and very much alive in the 1500s. And while theologians have long since moved past it in Tudor England, it shaped real attitudes, real decisions, real rooms full of people who exhaled just a little differently when a baby turned out to be a girl. It shaped, for example, the urgency around baptism. Infant mortality in Tudor England was devastating. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of children did not survive past the age of 5. Disease moved fast. Medicine moved slow. Winter was brutal. And for newborns, the first few days are the most dangerous of all. So, baptism happened quickly, sometimes within hours of birth. Because a baby who died without baptism, according to the church, could not enter heaven. They would exist in limbo, that gray, uncertain space that was not exactly punishment, but was certainly not paradise. And so in those terrifying early hours, the midwife held a remarkable kind of power. Midwives, women, almost always, women were granted something extraordinary by the Catholic Church. If a newborn appeared to be dying too weak, too pale, too still, the midwife was permitted to perform the baptism herself, right there, without a priest, without waiting. She would take a little war to speak the sacred words and baptize that fragile life in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Think about how significant that is. In a world where women could not preach, could not hold religious office, could not even speak aloud in church. In some traditions, these women were trusted with one of the most sacred acts in all of Christianity. Because someone had to be, and because women were the only ones in the room. There is a certain quiet irony there, is there not? The institution that spent centuries defining women as spiritually lesser handed them the power of salvation in the exact moments when it mattered most. One documented midwife of the early Tudor period, a woman named Alice Massey, who served the royal household, was so skilled, so trusted that she reportedly lost none of Queen Elizabeth of York's babies at birth. Not one. In an era when even royal births were wildly dangerous. That was extraordinary. She was paid very well for it, too, which tells you something about how much her work was valued, even if it was rarely celebrated outside those private rooms. Now, let's come back to that cold room, that quiet, that careful pause when a midwife announces the baby is a girl. For the wealthy, the noble family is the gentry. A daughter's arrival triggered an immediate calculation. What alliances do we need? Who might we marry her to? And how soon? Because in Tudor England, for families of any standing, a daughter was not simply a child. She was a future transaction. Marriage negotiations for some girls began before they were old enough to walk steadily. We have records of girls being promised in marriage as toddlers, the formal ceremony held years later, sometimes when they were 12 or 13. The church required that both parties consent and that girls be at least 12, before the marriage was fully binding. Technically, reality, as it tends to do, was considerably messier. Margaret Balfour, the mother of Henry V, the woman who practically built the Tudor dynasty from sheer force of will, was married for the second time at age 12. She gave birth to her son Henry at the age of 13. She reportedly suffered such physical damage from that birth that she never had another child, and she went on to become one of the most formidably intelligent, politically powerful women of her entire generation. Imagine what she might have done with a different start. For the poor, the vast majority of Tudor women who worked in fields, village markets, and cramped city rooms, the calculation was different, but the underlying message was the same. A poor daughter was labor. She could spin, she could cook, she could tend animals, she could brew ale. She was useful from an early age, but useful in a very specific, very contained way. She would learn what her mother knew, and her mother knew what her grandmother knew. The same unwritten curriculum passed down through generations by firelight. How to be invisible in public, competent in private, and quietly grateful for whatever life assigned her. And here's what breaks my heart a little honestly. Most Tudor girls never questioned it. Not because they were weak, not because they were unintelligent, but because the rules were so completely woven into the fabric of everyday life that they felt less like rules and more like nature itself. The sky is blue. Water flows downhill. Men lead and women follow. That was the water Tudor women swam in from their very first breath. And yet every now and then a girl arrived who looked at the world that had been decided for her and quietly, carefully, brilliantly began to rearrange it. Not loudly, never loudly. Tudor England had very little patience for loud women, but in whispered strategies, in the way they managed a household, in who they chose to trust, and who they let believe they were trustworthy. In the second marriages, they arranged for themselves when the first husband was barely cold. We're going to meet some of those women tonight. But before we can understand how they found the loopholes, we need to understand the trap itself. And the trap began in childhood in those years when every little Tudor girl was handed a very specific education. Not the kind filled with Latin and philosophy, the kind that teaches you exactly how much of yourself you allowed to take up in the world. Because what they taught Tudor girls, and what they very deliberately did not teach them, is one of the most quietly devastating stories in all of English history. And it starts right now. So here we are. You stayed. Good. Because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of thing that sounds almost too calculated to be true. And yet when you look at the historical record, it is all right there hiding in plain sight. Let us talk about what Tudor girls were taught, and more importantly, what they were not. Imagine you're a girl growing up in Tudor England. Let us say it is around 1520. You may be 7 or 8 years old. Your days have a rhythm, not the rhythm of curiosity or exploration, but the rhythm of preparation. Every morning, every lesson, every skill handed down from the woman in front of you is aimed at one destination. Marriage. Everything. Everything was in service of that single endpoint. Now, here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the education of a Tudor girl was not one thing. It was two completely different worlds, depending on which side of the social divide you were born into. And I find that contrast almost poetic in how much it reveals about what Tudor society truly valued. Let us start at the top. The daughters of the nobility, the gentry, the wealthy merchant class. On the surface, their education looked almost impressive. A highborn Tudor girl might learn to read in English, and sometimes in French or even Latin. She might be taught to play the lute or the virginal, a small keyboard instrument that sat in the lap like a secret. She learned to dance, and Tudor dancing was not the casual swaying. We might imagine it was precise political, a full-body performance of elegance and control. She learned to embroider, to paint, to write a graceful letter. She might study a little theology enough to be considered pious. On paper, that sounds like a real education. And compared to many women in other parts of the world and other eras, it was not nothing. But here's the question I always come back to when I think about this. Who was all that for? The lute was not for her personal joy. The dancing was not for her freedom. The French language, the graceful handwriting, the embroidery, so fine it could pass for printed cloth. None of it was designed to give her independence. It was designed to make her more desirable, more marriageable, more valuable on a market she had absolutely no power over. Think about it this way. A Tudor noblewoman's education was essentially a very sophisticated branding exercise performed on a human being who had not asked to be a product. In the most telling detail, the subjects that were never on the curriculum, law, finance, property management under her own name, business negotiation, any form of public speaking or rhetoric, the skills that would have given her the tools to navigate the world independently. Those were withheld not because Tudor society thought girls were incapable of learning them. The very existence of women like Lady Margaret Buffett, who ran vast estates and negotiated with kings, proved otherwise. They were withheld because an educated woman who understood law and finance was a woman who might ask inconvenient questions. And Tudor England preferred its women not to ask questions. Now, there were exceptions, and they are worth pausing on because they tell their own story. The daughters of Thomas More, the great humanist scholar, and eventually Lord Chancellor under Henry VIII, were given what was probably the most genuinely rigorous education available to women in early Tudor England. His eldest daughter Margaret More, later Margaret Rohr, studied Latin Greek philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. She translated works by the great scholar Erasmus from Latin into English, and Erasmus himself praised her intellect in writing, calling her scholarship exceptional for anyone, man or woman. Margaret Rohr was by any measure one of the most educated people in England in the 1520s. She could not hold office. She could not publish under her own name without controversy. She could not practice law or medicine. She managed her father's correspondence and helped him with his writings. Invaluable, invisible, uncredited. Her education was real, but her ceiling was still the same ceiling every Tudor woman pressed her head against. Here is what I find almost unbearably ironic about this. Thomas More, a man ahead of his time, in many ways genuinely progressive in his thinking about women's intellectual capacity, still ultimately saw his daughter's education as something that reflected on him. Their brilliance was his achievement. Margaret Rohr was living proof of what Thomas More believed about learning. She was the argument, not the arguer. Even the most enlightened fathers of the era could not quite get out of their own way. Let us shift now to the other world because the contrast is something I think about a lot. For the daughters of farmers, craftsmen, laborers, and the great struggling middle that made up most of Tudor England, formal education in any bookish sense was simply not a part of life. But in formal education, that was everything. A Tudor peasant girl learned from the moment she could walk. Not in a schoolroom, not from a tutor, but from watching, doing, failing, and being corrected by the woman beside her. By age 5 or 6, she might already be helping tend her kitchen garden, learning which plants healed and which harmed. By 8 or 9, she could spin while helping the dairy assist with younger siblings. By 12, she likely knew how to brew ale, and this was not a casual skill. Ale was safer to drink than water in most Tudor villages because of how it was made. So the woman who brewed the ale was in a very real sense keeping her family alive. She knew how to read the weather from cloud patterns. She knew which herbs brought down a fever, which ones eased a woman through labor, which ones you absolutely did not touch. She knew how to stretch a small amount of food into a meal that fed 6 people. She knew how to negotiate at a market stall without appearing to negotiate, because Tudor society frowned on women being overtly shrewd in business, even when they were the ones keeping the business running. That last part is worth sitting with for a moment. There was an art to genuine taught art to being capable without looking too capable. Tudor women of the lower classes learned to navigate the strange performance of appearing less competent, less authoritative, less decisive than they actually were. In public, the husband led. At home, often the wife quietly ran everything: the accounts, the food stores, the planning, the relationships with neighbors and traders. But the credit flowed upward. Sound familiar? I am asking genuinely, because when I sit with this history, I keep bumping into moments that do not feel distant at all. Now, there was one area of education where Tudor girls of all classes received something remarkably similar, and that was religious instruction. The church was the great equalizer in a sense. Whether you were the daughter of a duke or a dairyman, you were expected to know your prayers, to understand the basic tenets of the faith, to attend services, and to live a life that demonstrated Christian virtue. And Christian virtue for women was defined very specifically: obedience, silence, chastity, humility. These were not just spiritual qualities. They were behavioral requirements. There was even a popular word in Tudor England for a woman who failed to embody them. She was called a scold, a shrew, a woman who talked too much, argued too freely, expressed opinions too loudly, and the remedy for a scold that was one of the more unsettling corners of Tudor justice. There was an actual device, you may have seen images of it in history books, called the scold's bridle, a cage of iron that fitted over the head with a metal plate that pressed down on the tongue to prevent speech. It was used as a public punishment in some communities. I want to be precise here because this is important. Most historians agree the scold's bridle was not as widespread in Tudor England as it became in the 17th century. But the fact that it existed at all, that a society built an actual physical device designed to silence women, tells you something about how deeply the fear of a woman's voice ran. The fear was not really about noise. It was about authority, about who got to speak and whose words counted. Because here's the thing they understood, even if they never said it plainly. Language is power. The ability to name a problem, to argue a case, to tell a story, to change a mind, that is power in its most portable form. You cannot confiscate it. You cannot lock it away. So instead, they trained girls from birth not to use it, not to raise their voices, not to offer opinions unprompted, not to correct a man in public, even if he was clearly demonstrably wrong. The education of a Tudor girl was not simply about giving her skills. It was about defining the precise shape of the space she was allowed to occupy. And what is remarkable, what keeps drawing me back to this period, is how many women found ways to stretch those boundaries from the inside. They wrote letters that were really arguments framed as domestic conversation. They advised husbands in private in ways that appeared in public as the husband's own ideas. They passed knowledge between each other about health, about finances, about which local official could be persuaded, and how a network so informal they left almost no written record. Almost. There is a 16th century manuscript called The Good Housewife's Jewel, written by a man named Thomas Dawson, published around 1596. On the surface, it is a recipe book, instructions for preserving fruit, making medicines, preparing meals, and it is that. But read between the lines, and you see something else entirely: a record of the sophisticated knowledge that Tudor women maintained and shared across generations. Medical knowledge, herbal knowledge, knowledge that in a different century, in a different body, would have been called expertise. In Tudor England, it was called housewifery. The name did not diminish the knowledge, but it made sure the knowledge stayed where Tudor society wanted it, inside the house, invisible to the world outside. Now, everything I've described so far, the birth, the education, the careful sculpting of a Tudor girl's world, was all prologue, all preparation for one event that Tudor society considered the most important moment in a woman's life. Not her first prayer, not her first achievement, not the moment she became her own person, her wedding day. And what happened in the years leading up to that wedding day. The negotiations, the strategies, the moments where ordinary women somehow managed to shape their own fates in a system designed to give them no voice. That is the story we are stepping into right now. Because the Tudor marriage market was not just where women were traded. It was where some of them, against every expectation, quietly learned to trade back. The word choice is interesting, is it not? We use it so casually today. I chose this job. I chose this city. I chose this person to spend my life with. It is such an ordinary word for such an extraordinary privilege. The privilege of authorship over your own story. In Tudor England, for most women, that word did not quite mean what it means now. But here's the part that genuinely surprises people when they learn it. Tudor society did not think it was being cruel about this. It thought it was being practical, rational even. Marriage was simply too important, too tangled up with land money, political alliances, and family survival to be left to something as unpredictable as a young woman's personal feelings. That was the official position anyway. What actually happened behind closed doors in the weeks and months before a Tudor wedding is a much more complicated and honestly much more human story. Let's walk into it. First, the mechanics, because you cannot fully appreciate what these women were navigating without understanding exactly how the system was built. When a Tudor family began looking for a husband for their daughter, and began looking could mean anything from the girl being an infant to her being in her late teens. The process was less like matchmaking and more like a business merger. Two families would open negotiations the way companies open contract talks today. What does your family bring to the table? What is ours? What is the dowry? The sum of money, land goods, or some combination of all three that the bride's family would transfer to the groom's. And what was the jointure? The financial provision. The groom's family promised to settle on the bride in case she was widowed. The jointure matters more than people realize. And I want to pause here because it is one of those details that completely reframes how you understand Tudor women's lives. A jointure was in its quiet way a woman's only guaranteed financial safety net. It was the one thing that stood between a widow and total destitution. Negotiating a good jointure was not romantic. It was not sentimental, but it was survival. And the women who lived longest, who accumulated the most influence, who managed to carve out real lives on their own terms. Those women almost universally came from families who had negotiated fiercely on that joint clause before anyone said a word at the altar. This is why some Tudor mothers, women who had no formal legal power of their own, poured extraordinary energy into their daughters' marriage negotiations. They knew from personal experience exactly which clauses in that contract would matter 20 years later when everything else had changed. Now, there is a question I want to put to you because I think about it every time I dig into this period. The church required that both parties freely consent to a marriage. That was canon law. No forced marriage was considered valid in the eyes of God. So, technically, every Tudor woman who walked up to that altar had said yes. But what does yes mean when no is not really an option? What does yes mean when you've been raised since childhood to understand that refusing a match your family has arranged is an act of profound selfishness, that it threatens your family's finances, their alliances, their reputation, their future? What does yes mean when the alternative to marrying the man your father has chosen is in many cases a life of dependent poverty or the veil of a convent? I'm not saying Tudor women were all secretly miserable in their marriages. The historical record does not support that, and I think it would be patronizing to assume it. Many women genuinely grew to love their husbands. Many valued the security and status that a good match provided. Some arranged marriages were happy ones by any reasonable measure, but the consent was conditional in a way that the church's tidy legal language never quite captured. And every now and then a woman pushed back. There are documented cases, not many, but enough to be striking, of Tudor women who refused matches their families had arranged. Some paid dearly for it. A girl who refused a suitable match could find herself financially cut off, socially shamed, pressured through months of wearing family campaigns until she relented. One particularly grim set of letters preserved from the past family in the 15th century and carrying well into the early Tudor period shows a daughter named Marjorie Potton who fell in love with the family's household baith, a man far beneath her social station, and secretly contracted herself to him, which under church law constituted a binding pre-marriage agreement. Her family's response was devastating. Her mother refused to see her. She was described in letters as having been cast out of the household's regard. Her choice, her genuine, freely made romantic choice, was treated as a catastrophe, a betrayal, almost a kind of death. Marjorie stood firm. She married the man she loved, and history records almost nothing else about her, which in its own quiet way says everything. She made her choice, and the world largely erased her for it. Now let us talk about the women who played the game and played it brilliantly. And Berlin is the obvious example, almost too famous to be interesting anymore. And yet when you strip away the later drama, the Six Wives narrative, the scaffold at the end, when you look at in Berlin specifically in the years before she became queen, in the years when she was simply a young woman at court trying to navigate an impossible system, you see something genuinely extraordinary. And had been educated in France at the court of Queen Claude, wife of Francis I. This was not unusual for daughters of ambitious English families. The French court was considered the finishing school of European nobility, but absorbed something in France that went beyond embroidery and department. She absorbed a model of female influence that was more sophisticated than anything Tudor England offered. French court culture in the early 16th century had a tradition of the intellectual noble woman, the woman who held salons, who debated theology and literature, who wielded influence through the quality of her conversation and the breadth of her reading. This was not freedom, but it was a different kind of visibility, a different kind of permission. When, in return to the English court, she carried that different permission with her. She was not, by the standards of the time, conventionally beautiful. Contemporary descriptions focus on her dark eyes, her elegance, her wit, the things you notice about a person who is genuinely compelling, not merely decorative. She played the lute well. She danced brilliantly. But what set and apart, what made her dangerous and irresistible in equal measure was that she talked back carefully, artfully, never crudely, but she held opinions. She expressed them, and she made the men around her feel intellectually challenged rather than simply admired. Henry VIII, who was accustomed to women who deferred to him in everything, found this intoxicating. Now, here's where my personal reading of history diverges a little from the romantic version. I do not think Anne Boleyn set out to become Queen of England. I think she set out to survive, to secure a position for herself that offered some protection against the precariousness of a woman's life at court. She aimed initially for a prestigious marriage, perhaps the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, with whom she had a genuine attachment that was broken up by Cardinal Wolsey on the king's orders. That interference, that abrupt reminder that her choices were not entirely her own, may have been what shifted her strategy entirely, because after that, and stopped playing by the expected rules, she withheld what every other woman in her position had been pressured to provide. She made Henry wait for years, 7 years some historians estimate, and in doing so she transformed a passing royal interest into an obsession that reshaped the entire religious and political landscape of England. I want to say something carefully here, because I think this point often gets lost, and did not win, not by the end. The system she tried to work eventually consumed her, but for roughly a decade, she bent the rules of Tudor womanhood more dramatically than almost anyone before or after her, not by rejecting the system, but by understanding it so precisely that she could find the pressure points. That is not a small thing. That is, depending on how you look at it, a kind of genius. And then there is Bess of Hardwicke, a woman who I would argue understood the Tudor marriage market better than anyone in the 16th century and used that understanding to build one of the most remarkable personal empires in English history. Bess was born around 1527, the daughter of a minor Derbyshire gentleman of modest means, not wealthy, not particularly welcomed, the kind of girl for whom Tudor society had fairly limited expectations. She married 4 times. Her first husband, Robert Barlow, died within months of their marriage, leaving her a widow before she was fully an adult. But he left her property, and Bess paid attention to what property could do. Her second husband, Sir William Kendish, was a much older man, a widower and a government official who had done well out of the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. Bess managed his household, bore him 8 children in 10 years, and more crucially persuaded him to consolidate their land holdings in Derbyshire, her home county, rather than scattering them across England. When William Kendish died in 1557, Bess held those Derbyshire lands. Her third husband brought more wealth. Her fourth, George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, brought a title and a position so elevated that she found herself ironically responsible for guarding Mary, Queen of Scots, during her long English imprisonment. a minor gentleman's daughter from Derbyshire, keeping watch over a queen. That is a trajectory that defies the logic of the system that was supposed to contain her. By the time Bess of Hardwick died in 6008, she was the second wealthiest woman in England after Elizabeth I. She had built Hardwick Hall, one of the greatest Elizabethan houses still standing today. A building so laden with her initials carved into the stone battlements that architectural historians have called it one of the most self-assertive buildings of the entire period. She put her initials on the skyline in Tudor England, where women were supposed to disappear into their husbands' households. Think about what that took. Not luck, though. Luck played a role. Not just beauty or charm, though these helped. What it took was an understanding ruthlessly practical and almost coldly strategic of exactly how the marriage system worked, and a willingness to use every legal, financial, and social tool within its rules to push those rules as far as they would go. Bess of Hardwick did not break the system. She mastered it, and that is perhaps the most quietly revolutionary thing a Tudor woman could do. Because here's what strikes me every time I come back to this period. The women who found freedom within Tudor society were almost never the ones who raged against the rules openly. They were the ones who learned the rules better than the men who made them, and then patiently, carefully, sometimes over decades, found every possible inch of space inside those rules to call their own. There is something almost unbearably patient about that kind of survival. Which brings us to the next dimension of Tudor women's lives, one that affected every woman, regardless of whether she had managed to marry brilliantly or disastrously. Because once the wedding was done, once the negotiations were settled and the vows were spoken and the celebrations ended, the real unwritten rules began. The rules about the body, about what happened in the years between a wedding and a death in the rooms where no history book spent very much time. The rules about pregnancy, about childbirth, about the strange and very specific set of rituals that Tudor society wrapped around a woman's body every time she carried new life rituals that said far more about power and control than they ever said about care. That is where we're going next. And I promise you, it is one of the most surprising corners of this entire story. There's a room I want you to imagine. Not a grand room, not a throne room or a banquet hall, just a small, warm chamber, the windows sealed shut with cloth. The curtains drawn so tight that no daylight enters. Candles burn low on every surface. The air is thick with smoke, dried herbs, and something older than either of those. The particular kind of silence that only settles over a place where something enormous is about to happen. This is the lying chamber, and in Tudor England, it was one of the most revealing rooms in the entire world. Because the lying-in chamber, the room where a Tudor woman retreated in the final weeks of pregnancy to give birth and recover, was not simply a practical space. It was a statement, a set of beliefs made visible in curtained fabric and sealed windows, and the very precise list of who was and was not allowed through the door. And what that room tells us about how Tudor society understood women's bodies is something I find genuinely astonishing even now after reading about it for years. Let us start with what the lying-in chamber actually was and why it existed. From roughly a month before her expected delivery date, a Tudor woman of any social standing was expected to withdraw from the world. She would retire to her chamber with a group of female companions. Her mother, if she was nearby, close friends, trusted female servants, and she would not emerge again in the eyes of society until she'd undergone a specific religious ceremony called the churching. That ceremony typically happened 40 days after the birth of a son or 80 days after the birth of a daughter. You might recognize those numbers. They're the same numbers as the theological teaching about when a male and female fetus received a soul. The same 40 and 80 days we spoke about earlier in Tudor England. Theology and daily practice were not two separate things. They were the same thing expressed in different languages. But here's what I want to focus on, because this is where it gets genuinely strange and worth sitting with. The lying-in chamber was not just about rest. It was not simply a practical arrangement for a woman who had just gone through one of the most physically demanding experiences a human body can endure. It was built on a specific belief, for one that the church and Tudor society shared without much question, that a woman who had recently given birth was in some sense spiritually impure, not sinful, not wicked, just temporarily unclean, set apart, requiring a formal act of reentry into the community before she could fully participate in it again. The churching ceremony was that act of reentry. The woman would go to church, kneel at the altar rail, give an offering, usually a sum of money or a gift of candles, and receive a blessing. After that, she was back. She could attend church services, join social gatherings, resume her place in her household and her community before the churching. Technically, she should not be doing any of those things. In some communities, the restrictions were taken seriously enough that a woman who had recently given birth was not supposed to enter a neighbor's house, lest she bring some form of misfortune with her. Now, I want to be careful here because churching is one of those historical practices that gets oversimplified in both directions. Some historians argue it was purely a joyful celebration, a community welcome back for a woman who had survived something genuinely dangerous. And there is real evidence for that reading. The ceremony was often followed by a feast, friends gathering, gifts being brought. For many women, it may have felt more like a party than a punishment. But the underlying logic, the idea that a woman's body after childbirth was in some state that required cleansing before she could fully rejoin society, is not neutral. Whatever the celebratory wrapping around it, that core idea says something about how Tudor society conceived of women's bodies as fundamentally more complicated, more in need of management and regulation than men's, and the lying in chamber itself made that visible in a very particular way. The sealed windows were not just for warmth. Tudor medical thinking, drawing heavily on ancient Greek theories about the body's four humors, which have been circulating in European medicine since the classical period, held that cold air, particularly cold drafts, were as dangerous to a woman recovering from childbirth. The body was understood to be in a vulnerable open state. So the windows were sealed, the curtains were drawn. Even in summer, the chamber was kept dim and warm. For a wealthy woman, this created a rather extraordinary hothouse environment. The chamber might be hung with rich tapestries, the bed built up with multiple mattresses, the floors strewn with fresh rushes and herbs, lavender, rosemary, sweet marjoram that scented the air, and were believed to have protective, strengthening properties. Her companions would keep her company, bringing food and drink, reading aloud, playing music softly. In material terms, it could sound almost pleasant, but consider it from another angle. A Tudor noble woman in her lying in chamber was completely cut off from the management of her household. Her husband continued to run his affairs, see his associates conduct his business. Her world contracted to a single room, a single function, and producing the child, surviving the birth, and waiting out the prescribed recovery period before society would accept her back. She was for those weeks entirely dependent. And for a woman who might otherwise have been running a complex estate, managing accounts, supervising dozens of servants, corresponding with business contacts on her husband's behalf that enforced dependence, was not just uncomfortable. It was a demonstration, however unintentional, of who the system ultimately believed was in charge. Now, let us talk about what actually happened during the birth itself, because this is where Tudor medicine reaches in a territory that is genuinely jaw-dropping by modern standards. And I mean that with complete respect for the women who practiced it and the women who endured it, because they were doing the best they could with what they had. But what they had was sometimes very far from what we know now. Childbirth in Tudor England was entirely managed by women. This is important. Men, including physicians, were generally not present at births. The lying in chamber was female space, and midwives were the authorities within it. This was not just custom. It was widely understood that a male presence at a birth was inappropriate, even indecent. This arrangement had interesting consequences. On one hand, it meant that the most detailed practical knowledge about childbirth was held exclusively by women and passed between them through apprenticeship and experience. Midwives who had attended hundreds of births developed genuine expertise, an empirical understanding of what to do when labor stalled, when a baby was positioned badly, when a mother was bleeding too much. That had real value and real results. On the other hand, it meant that this knowledge was almost entirely excluded from the emerging world of formal medicine. Universities were training male physicians in the 15th and 16th centuries. Those physicians were learning anatomy from dissected bodies, mostly male bodies, and from ancient texts written by Greek and Roman physicians who had also been male. The lived, practical, accumulated knowledge of midwifery simply did not make it into those institutions. It existed in a parallel world, transmitted through oral instruction and hands-on experience, never written into the textbooks, never formally validated. And because it was not written down in the right places, it was not protected when challenges came. In 1512, the English Parliament passed an act requiring medical practitioners in London and its surrounding area to obtain a license. This was aimed primarily at regulating physicians and surgeons, but it created a framework that would over subsequent decades be used to challenge the authority of midwives, particularly those without formal credentials that could be assessed by a licensing body made up entirely of men who had never attended a birth in their lives. I find something almost perfectly symbolic about that. The people with the least direct experience of childbirth slowly accumulating the institutional authority to determine who is qualified to manage it. The people with the most experience being required to justify their knowledge to those who had none. But let us come back to the chamber because there is more inside it. Tudor beliefs about what a pregnant woman should and should not do were elaborate, detailed, and reflect a society deeply invested in controlling the female body even before the birth itself. A pregnant woman was advised to avoid strong emotions, not just extreme distress, though that was considered particularly dangerous, but excitement, excessive laughter, even prolonged conversation about disturbing topics. The belief was that a mother's emotional state directly shaped the physical and moral character of the child she was carrying. A woman who spent too much time in grief might produce a melancholic child. A woman who was frequently startled might produce a nervous or fearful one. Now, at first glance, this might sound like the sort of thing well-meaning people still say today. Stay calm. Avoid stress. It is good for the baby. And there is a germ of truth in it, as modern science has confirmed that maternal stress hormones do have some effect on fetal development. But the Tudor version went considerably further. There was a widespread belief documented in medical texts and midwifery manuals of the period that a pregnant woman who saw or was frightened by a particular animal might produce a child with features that resembled that animal, or that a woman who strongly desired a certain food and was denied it might produce a child marked with an image of that food on their skin. This belief had a name. It was called maternal impression, and it was not fringe folk superstition. It appeared in serious medical literature of the period cited by respectable physicians, debated in learned circles, which meant that a pregnant Tudor woman who gave birth to a child with any unusual feature, a birth arc of physical irregularity of any kind, was potentially subject to questions about what she had seen, desired, or felt during the pregnancy. The body of the child became evidence about the conduct of the mother. That is a remarkable amount of pressure to place on a person who is already going through something extraordinarily difficult. And then the birth itself. Tudor midwives worked with a set of tools and techniques that combined genuine practical wisdom with beliefs we would now consider unfounded and sorting. Between them, in retrospect, is not always straightforward. They used birthing stools, low horseshoe-shaped seats that allowed a laboring woman to sit upright, working with gravity rather than against it, which modern obstetrics has actually returned to as a valid position for labor. They used herbal preparations, some of which contain compounds that we now know do have real effects on uterine contractions. They were trained in techniques for turning a baby that was poorly positioned, a skill that required both knowledge and physical confidence. But they also used amulets, small objects of eagle stone, a type of hollow iron, or that rattled when shaken, believed to ease labor when tied to the laboring woman's thigh. They used written prayers placed on the body. They recited incantations. In the pre-Reformation period, relics of saints, small objects associated with holy figures, were sometimes brought into the chamber and held or placed near the woman in labor. After the Reformation changed everything from the 1530s onward under the religious reforms driven by Henry VIII break with Rome, many of these Catholic-associated practices were officially discouraged or banned. The relics were gone. The old prayers were suspect, but the eagle stones stayed. The herbal preparation stayed because some knowledge is too practically useful to disappear just because the official theology changes. Let me tell you about Jane Seymour. Not because her story is unknown. It is not. But because it crystallizes something about this entire period so precisely. Jane Seymour was the third wife of Henry VIII. She was the one he'd been waiting for. Or so he told himself. She gave him a son, Edward. born in October of 1537. The birth was long and difficult, lasting, according to some accounts, as long as 2 days and 3 nights. Jane survived it. She was reported as doing well in the days immediately following, and then 12 days after the birth, she was dead. The official cause was recorded as childbed fever, what we now know to be a bacterial infection almost certainly introduced during or after the delivery, against which Tudor medicine had essentially no defense. Childbed fever killed women across all classes, all ages, all levels of care. It did not distinguish between a queen attended by England's best physicians and a farmer's wife attended by the village midwife. Henry VIII reportedly went into genuine mourning. He wore black for months. He was buried at his own request beside Jane. And I think about Jane Seymour sometimes when I read about the lying in chamber and all its elaborate rituals, the sealed windows, the herbal rushes, the careful management of the air and the light and the emotional atmosphere. All of that care, all of that effort, and a bacterial infection, invisible and unnamed, moved through it like it was not there at all. The women of Tudor England were not passive in the face of these dangers. They developed networks of support, sharing information about which midwives were most skilled, which remedies had worked, which had not. They wrote it down when they could in household books and personal letters. They prepared for birth with the same practical thoroughness they brought to everything else in their lives. They simply did not have the tools to fight what they could not see. And here's the thing that brings me back to the central thread of this whole story. The lying in chamber, with all its rules and restrictions and rituals, was supposed to be about protecting women. The churching ceremony was framed as a celebration. The prohibition on male physicians attending births was described as a matter of decency. But protection and control are not the same thing, and care and containment are not the same thing. When you look closely at all of these practices together, the sealed chamber, the prescribed isolation, the 40 or 80 days before a woman was socially restored, the belief that her emotions shaped her child, the requirement that she submit to a formal religious ceremony before she could fully rejoin the community. You see a picture that is about far more than maternal health. You see a picture of a society working very hard to manage the one thing it could not fully control: the fact that women were the ones who produced the next generation. That this enormous, irreplaceable power, the power to sustain human life itself, lived in female bodies. The lying in chamber was in its quiet way the most honest room in Tudor England. And now that we understand what happened to a Tudor woman's body, there's another layer waiting for us. Because the rules did not stop at the chamber door. They followed her back out into the world, into her marriage, into her daily life, into the relationship with the man who was under Tudor law. Not just her husband, but her legal guardian, her financial controller, and in some very real senses, her sovereign. How much power did a Tudor husband actually have? And where exactly was the line that even Tudor society admitted should not be crossed? That is the question waiting in part 5. And the answer is more complicated and honestly more surprising than most people expect. There's a legal concept from Tudor England that once you understand, it makes everything else about women's lives in that era suddenly click into place. It is called coverture, and it is one of those words that sounds almost gentle, almost poetic, until you understand what it actually means. Coverture came from the old French legal term meaning covered. A married woman in Tudor England was under the law, covered by her husband. Her legal identity did not disappear entirely, but it was absorbed into his. She could not own property independently. She could not sign contracts in her own name. She could not sue or be sued without her husband being party to the action. Any wages she earned belonged legally to him. Any goods she brought into the marriage, clothing, jewelry, personal possessions, became his upon the wedding day. In the eyes of Tudor law, a married woman was not quite a full legal person. The great English legal commentator William Blackton would later describe this arrangement in the 18th century with a phrase so perfectly chillingly tidy that it has stuck in the historical memory ever since: husband and wife are one person in law, and that person is the husband. He wrote that in the 1700s, but the principle he was describing had been operating in England for centuries before that. It was already the world Tudor women woke up into every morning. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think this is a question worth sitting with. If you had grown up in a world where this was simply how things worked, where it was as obvious and unremarkable as the fact that the sun rises in the east, Would you have questioned it? I'm not asking to be provocative. I am asking because I think the honest answer for most of us is probably not immediately. Not without a comparison point. Not without something to push against. Most of the women had no comparison point. Coverture was not experienced as a deprivation because there was nothing outside it to measure the deprivation against. It was simply the shape of the world. And within that world, the relationship between a Tudor husband and wife operated according to a set of unwritten but deeply understood rules about authority, responsibility, and yes, the limits of a husband's power. Because here's where it gets more complicated than the simple narrative of helpless wives and all-powerful husbands. Tudor society did grant husbands significant authority over their wives. This was theological. The Bible, as interpreted through both Catholic and later Protestant traditions, positioned the husband as the head of the household, with a wife's obedience framed as a spiritual duty, not merely a social one. It was legal cover, gave husbands control over property and contracts. It was cultural sermons, conduct manuals. Popular literature all reinforced the image of the properly obedient wife as the ideal. But that authority was not absolute, and the boundaries around it reveal something interesting about what Tudor society actually valued. A husband was expected to govern his household, but governing and tyrannizing were understood, at least in principle, as two different things. Conduct literature of the period. Those instructional books about how to be a good husband, a good wife, a well-ordered household consistently portrayed the ideal husband not as a desperate, but as a responsible authority. He was supposed to be firm. Yes, he was supposed to be obeyed. But he was also supposed to be reasonable, to provide for his wife's needs, to treat her with something at least resembling care. The legal position was similarly nuanced, and this is a part of Tudor history that genuinely surprises people. A husband did have the legal right to physically discipline his wife, but the law placed conditions on it. He was not permitted to be cruel. He was not permitted to inflict what the period called excessive correction. If he went beyond those limits, if he endangered her life or inflicted serious harm, he could be brought before a court. Could be, and sometimes was. There are documented cases from Tudor ecclesiastical courts, the church courts that handled much of what we would now call family law, where women brought complaints against husbands for behavior that exceeded what even Tudor society considered acceptable. These cases are not common. They represent only a fraction of what must have actually occurred. But they exist, and their existence matters because it means the legal framework, however imperfect, acknowledged that a wife's safety had some claim on the law's attention. Now let us talk about the rule of thumb. You've probably heard this phrase. You may have heard it explained as coming from an old law that supposedly permitted a husband to physically discipline his wife with a stick, provided the stick was no thicker than his thumb. I want to be very direct with you about this. That law did not exist. Historians have searched exhaustively through English legal records, statutes, court documents, legal commentaries, and found no evidence of any such rule. The phrase rule of thumb appears in English from the 17th century onward as a general expression, meaning a rough, practical guideline. The attribution of a domestic violence law appears to have developed much later, probably in the 19th and 20th centuries, when it was used in feminist legal arguments with good intentions, but without historical accuracy. I bring this up not to minimize anything that Tudor women experienced, because the reality of their lives was difficult enough without inventing additional horrors, but because I think accuracy matters. Getting the history right matters, and the real story of how Tudor law handled marriage and authority is actually more interesting and more morally complex than the simplified version suggests. The real situation was this. A husband's authority was extensive, culturally reinforced, and largely unchallenged in practice. But it was not legally unlimited, and the very existence of those limits, however, inadequately enforced, tells us that Tudor society was not entirely comfortable with unchecked power over women. There was a flaw, even if it was set very low. What mattered then, what determined whether a Tudor woman's marriage was tolerable or something much darker, was not primarily the law. It was the man she had married. And since, as we discussed in part 3, women had limited power over who that man was, this reality cast a very long shadow. Let us talk about what happened when a marriage became genuinely unbearable. Because the options available to Tudor women in that situation were, to put it plainly, appalling by modern standards. Divorce, as we understand it today, a legal dissolution of a marriage that left both parties free to remarry, essentially did not exist in Tudor England before the Reformation. And even after the Reformation, it remained extraordinarily rare and difficult to obtain. What was available was annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been legally valid in the first place. The grounds for annulment were narrow. The parties were too closely related, by blood or by a previous marriage. One party had been previously married, and their spouse was still living. One party had been unable to consent due to age or incapacity, or, and this is where it got complicated, one party was unable to consummate the marriage. Notice what is not on that list: cruelty, neglect, infidelity, abandonment, simple, profound misery. None of those things were grounds for ending a marriage. A woman who found herself in a deeply unhappy or genuinely dangerous marriage had, in practical terms, three options. She could endure it. She could seek a legal separation called separation from bed and board, which allowed a couple to live apart and might give her some financial protection, but did not dissolve the marriage or allow either party to remarry. Or she could enter a convent. That last option, which Henry VIII presented to Catherine of Aragon as a solution to their marriage difficulties, was not quite the cold-blooded dismissal it might appear from the outside. Convents in the pre-Reformation period were actually one of the few spaces in Tudor society where women held genuine institutional authority. An abbess ran her community. She managed property, supervised a workforce, made administrative decisions, and did so in her own right, not as a representative of a husband or father. But the Reformation dismantled that option entirely. When Henry VIII broke from Rome in the 1530s and dissolved the monasteries and convents of England between 1536 and 1540, he did not just reorganize religion. He eliminated the one institutional alternative to marriage that Tudor society had offered women. The nuns who had lived in those communities were sent out into the world, given small pensions in many cases, expected to find their own way. Some returned to family, some married, some found work as teachers or nurses, or in the households of the newly Protestant gentry, and some simply disappeared from the historical record, which is its own kind of testimony about how difficult that transition was. Catherine of Aragon refused the convent option when Henry offered it, and I find her refusal one of the most quietly extraordinary acts of the entire Tudor period. Catherine had been Queen of England for over 20 years. She had governed the country in Henry's absence during his campaigns in France, overseeing the response to the Scottish invasion at the Battle of Flodden Field in 1513, a genuinely significant military and administrative achievement that history tends to footnote when it mentions Catherine at all. She had been a loyal wife by the standards of her time and her faith, and she understood with the precision of someone who had spent decades at the center of European politics exactly what was at stake. If she agreed to an annulment, she was not just losing her marriage. She was declaring that her daughter Mary, the future Mary the First of England, was illegitimate. She was undermining the honor of her family, the royal house of Spain, and the sacred institution of marriage itself, as the Church defined it. Catherine refused for years, under house arrest, separated from her daughter, stripped progressively of her title, her household, and her access to anyone who might offer her support. She refused. She was not refusing out of sentiment. She was refusing on principle, and she used every tool available to her. Her extensive knowledge of church law, her connections to the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor, her sophisticated understanding of diplomatic leverage to fight her case on the international stage. She did not win. Henry married in Berlin. The English Church broke from Rome. Catherine spent the last years of her life in reduced and isolated circumstances, describing herself in letters as the Queen and Henry's true wife until her death in January of 1536. But she made him pay for every inch of it. And what I want to offer you here is not simply admiration, though admiration feels appropriate, but something sharper. Catherine of Aragon's resistance reveal something important about the nature of the rules we've been talking about all evening. The unwritten rules of Tudor womanhood said that a wife submitted to her husband's authority. But the unwritten rules also said that submission should be met with the obligations of care and provision and reasonable treatment. When the obligations collapsed on one side, the submission was not automatically owed on the other. Tudor women understood this not as a legal argument, and not in the language of rights as we would use it today, but in a quieter, older language of duty, honor, and what a person of conscience owed to God and to themselves. Catherine appealed not to her own desires, but to her conscience, to what she believed God required of her. In doing so, she found a space that even Tudor patriarchy had difficulty entirely closing off, because Tudor society needed women to have consciences. It needed them to be morally serious, spiritually accountable, genuinely virtuous, and genuine virtue, it turned out, could not always be perfectly controlled. That tension between the obedience a wife owed and the conscience a woman retained ran through Tudor marriage like a hidden seam. Most women navigated it quietly, privately, in ways that left no record. A few, like Catherine, navigated it on the stage of history. And then there were the women who found a completely different solution. The women who waited, not passively, not helplessly, but with the particular patience of someone who understood that the rules of their world contained one enormous exception, one circumstance under which a Tudor woman could step out from cover entirely on property, make contracts, run businesses, and live on her own terms. That circumstance was widowhood. And the story of Tudor widows is one of the most surprising, complicated, and honestly delightful chapters in this entire history. Because what happened to some of these women when their husbands died is something that Tudor society absolutely did not intend and could not quite bring itself to undo. That story is waiting for us right now. Here is something that Tudor society never quite intended to happen. It created a legal loophole, a gap in the architecture of control that had spent generations carefully constructing. And that gap had a name. It was called widowhood. And what some Tudor women did with it, the speed with which they moved, the precision with which they acted, the sheer audacity of some of the choices they made. The moment they were legally free to make choices is one of the most quietly thrilling stories in this entire history. Let us start with the law, because you cannot appreciate the freedom without first understanding the cage it replaced. We talked in part 5 about cover, that legal doctrine that absorbed a married woman's identity into her husband's, stripping her of the independent right to own property, sign contracts, or conduct business under her own name. Undercover, a married woman was described in legal terminology as a femme covert, a covered woman hidden beneath the legal shadow of her husband. But there was a counterpart to femme covert in Tudor law, and it is the counterpart that changes everything. A woman who was unmarried, whether she had never married or whether she was widowed, was described as a fille sole, a woman alone, and a femme sole occupied an entirely different legal universe. A femme sole could own property outright. She could sign contracts. She could sue and be sued in her own name. She could conduct business, take on apprentices, run a shop, lend money, collect debts. She was, in the eyes of Tudor law, a full legal person. Now this status applied in theory to unmarried women as well as widows. But in practice, in the actual lived experience of Tudor England, it was widows who most frequently and most powerfully inhabited it. Because an unmarried woman of any social standing was almost always under the authority of a father or male guardian, which created its own informal version of cover, even without the legal label. A widow, by contrast, emerged from her husband's death with a specific legal inheritance, specific property rights, and crucially no father left to push her toward another husband if she did not want one. She was, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, answerable primarily to herself. The specific property mechanism that made this possible was called dayar rights. And understanding dayar rights is essential to understanding why widowhood was so significant. Under English common law, as it operated in the Tudor period, a widow was entitled to a life interest in 1/3 of all the freehold land her husband had owned during their marriage. Not a gift, not something he had to choose to leave her. A legal right built into the structure of property law that she was owed automatically. She cannot be bought out of it without her consent. She cannot be pressured into surrendering it, at least not legally, though pressure was certainly applied in practice. That 1/3 of the land was hers to use to profit from and to manage for the rest of her life. For the widow of a wealthy man, this was transformative. It meant income from rents. It meant the right to make decisions about how that land was farmed, leased, and maintained. It meant a financial foundation that could, in the hands of a capable woman, be built into something considerably larger than the original third. And Tudor women, the ones who had spent their entire lives watching how property worked, how money moved, how men estates frequently turn out to be very capable indeed. I want to introduce you to someone who does not appear in most popular histories of this period, but who I find endlessly fascinating. Alice Barnum was a London merchant's widow who, after her husband's death in the 1550s, continued operating the family's trading business under her own name. She appears in London Guild records and legal documents in correspondence related to trade disputes. A whole paper trail of a woman conducting business with the confidence of someone who'd been watching how it was done for decades and was now simply doing it herself. Alice Barnum is not famous. She did not advise kings or survive royal intrigue, but she represents something that the historical record, when you dig carefully through it, shows over and over again. Tudor merchant widows were a significant economic force in London's commercial life, present in trades ranging from textile dealing to money lending to the import and export goods. The Goldsmiths Company, one of London's great livery companies, kept records showing that widows of guild members were entitled to continue their husband's businesses after his death running the shop, training apprentices, maintaining the guild membership that gave them access to London's regulated trades. This was not charity. It was practical recognition that the widow often knew the business as well as or better than her husband had because she'd been managing its daily operations from the inside for years. What strikes me about this, and I've thought about it quite a bit, is the gap between the official narrative and the operational reality. Officially, Tudor women were not business people. They were wives, mothers, daughters. Commerce was a male domain. But look at the actual records. Look at who was handling the accounts when the husband was away on business. Look at who was negotiating with suppliers in the local market. Look at who was managing the household budget, which in a Tudor merchant family was not a small thing. It encompassed everything from food procurement to servant wages to the maintenance of stock and equipment. The official narrative said women did not do these things. The records show they did them constantly. They just did not always get the credit. Widowhood was the moment the credit became visible because now she was the one signing the documents. Now let me tell you about Lady Margaret Balfour, but from a completely different angle than the one we touched on in part 1. We mentioned her earlier in the context of her early marriage and the physical toll it took on her body. That is one part of her story, but the part that belongs in a conversation about widowhood and power is something else entirely. Margaret Balfour was widowed multiple times, and each widowhood gave her incrementally more control over her own circumstances. By the time her son Henry VIII had secured the throne in 1485, and the Tudor dynasty she'd worked toward for decades was finally a reality, Margaret was in her early 40s, and she made a decision that was for Tudor England genuinely extraordinary. She took a vow of chastity, not because she entered a convent, she did not. She continued to live in the world, to manage estates, to found colleges, to participate in court life. But she took a formal religious vow administered by her son's first Bishop of Winchester that she would not remarry. Think about what that meant practically. It meant that no one, not her son, the king, not any ambitious nobleman, not the pressures of diplomatic marriage making that shaped so many Tudor lives could arrange another husband for her. She had used religion, the most unassailable authority available to a Tudor woman, to permanently close the door on the one mechanism by which her independence might have been taken away again. She then spent the next 25 years building one of the most significant legacies in the history of English education. She founded Christ's College at Cambridge. She refounded St. John's College at Cambridge. The project was completed after her death, but driven entirely by her planning and her money. She endowed professorships. She supported the early English printing press. She translated religious texts from French into English. She did all of this as a fee sole, as a woman alone in the most legally empowered sense that Tudor England offered. And the king, her own son, let her, more than let her. Henry VIII passed a special act of parliament formally granting his mother the status of a fee sole despite being technically still living under his authority as an unmarried woman under his roof. He gave her by royal and parliamentary decree the full legal independence that widowhood and her vow had already given her in practice. I find that detail remarkable. A king passing a law to make his mother more powerful in Tudor England. It tells you something about what Margaret Buffett had made of herself by that point, and about how even a patriarchal system, when confronted with a woman of sufficient capability and moral authority, sometimes simply stepped aside. But Margaret Bowett was exceptional. Most Tudor widows faced a more complicated reality, because while widowhood offered legal freedom, it came packaged with social pressure that was relentless, creative, and sometimes quite unsubtle. The pressure to remarry Tudor society had complicated feelings about widows. On one hand, it genuinely needed them to remarry, particularly widows of childbearing age with property, because remarriage brought that property back under male control and potentially produced more children, which served both family and social interests. On the other hand, Tudor culture was deeply suspicious of widows who were too eager to remarry, or who were seen to be enjoying their freedom too openly. This tension produced one of the most revealing cultural phenomena of the entire period: the figure of the merry widow in Tudor literature, theater, and popular culture. The merry widow was a stock character, a woman who had outlived her husband coming to property and independence, and was now in the eyes of her society a problem. She had freedom she had not earned and did not deserve. She had money and no male supervisor. She might remarry for love instead of family interest, which was economically inefficient. She might not remarry at all, which was worse. She might enjoy herself in ways that made men around her uncomfortable. Tudor comedies and popular songs returned to this character again and again, sometimes mocking her, sometimes secretly admiring her, often doing both simultaneously. The laughter had an edge of anxiety to it, because the merry widow, however much she was caricatured, represented something real. The proof that Tudor women, given freedom, did not necessarily collapse into helplessness. Some of them thrived conspicuously, and Tudor society was not entirely sure what to do with that information. The social mechanics of widow remarriage were themselves revealing. A wealthy young widow was considered fair game for courtship almost immediately after her period of mourning ended. And the mourning period for a widow, while expected to be observed, was not always given much time before suitors appeared. Remarriage within a year of a husband's death was not unusual among the property classes. Remarriage within months happened. The speed was not callousness. It was economics. A widow with property was a target. Suitors had strong incentives to move quickly before she established independent rhythms, before she had time to discover how well she managed alone, before she decided, as some women decidedly did, that she preferred her own company to another husband's authority. We have letters from Tudor women explicitly discussing this calculation. One widow writing to a female friend in the 1560s described the parade of callers after her husband's death with a dry humor that reads almost entirely modern. She listed their qualities, their properties, their persistent visits, and their apparent inability to understand that she had just spent 20 years managing a large household without much visible assistance, and was finding the silence rather pleasant. She remarried eventually, but on her own timeline, and to a man considerably younger than the first candidates had been, which the historical record notes with a certain audible disapproval that she does not seem to have lost any sleep over. This is what I find most alive in the history of Tudor widows. Not the legal mechanisms or even the famous cases, but the texture of ordinary women discovering sometimes for the first time in their lives what it felt like to make decisions, small decisions and large ones. What to eat, when to rise, how to structure a day, whether to attend a social. Engagement, how much to spend, who to trust. The unwritten rules of Tudor womanhood said that a woman needed a man to navigate the world for her, that she was too emotionally fragile, too intellectually limited, too spiritually vulnerable to manage independently. And then a husband would die, and the woman left behind would pick up the ledger books and the estate accounts and the correspondence with tenants and suppliers, and simply manage competently, sometimes brilliantly. Without the infrastructure of male authority that was supposed to be essential, it must have been for some of them an astonishing discovery about themselves. And yet, and this is the part that always catches in my chest a little, even this freedom had a ceiling. Even a Tudor widow who managed her estates brilliantly, who built a business, who educated her children well, and ran her household without a single visible stumble. Even she could not step fully outside the system. She could not vote. She could not hold public office. She could not preach or teach in formal institutions. She could not fully control what happened to her property after her own death, since the laws of inheritance still ran primarily through male lines. The freedom of widowhood was real, but it was freedom within a structure that had been built by others for purposes that did not primarily include her flourishing. Which brings us to the part of Tudor women's lives that the structure tried hardest to control, not their property, not their bodies, not even their marriages, but their voices, their reputations, the public story that others told about them, and the ways they were permitted or not permitted to tell their own. Because in Tudor England, a woman's reputation was not just her social currency. It was her armor and the rules around it, who could damage it, how it could be defended, and what it cost when it was taken away reveals something about this society that still lands with uncomfortable force. That is where we are headed next. And I promise you, the stories waiting there are ones you will not forget. Picture the courtroom for a moment. Not a grand one. A small wood-paneled room in one of England's ecclesiastical courts. The church courts that handled, among other things, matters of moral reputation and social conduct. It is sometime in the 1500s. The air smells of tallow candles and old paper. A Clare is writing. A judge in clerical robes presides, and standing before him, making her case, is a Tudor woman. She's not there because she committed a crime. She's there because someone said something about her. 3 words or 4 spoken in a market square, or across a garden fence, or at the village. Well, words that traveled as words always do. Faster than anyone intended and farther than anyone admitted. And those words have the power to destroy her life. This is where the story of Tudor women's reputations gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely surprising. Because when most people think about reputation in Tudor England, they imagine women as entirely passive in the face of gossip, victims of whatever narrative their community chose to impose on them with no recourse and no voice. The reality is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. Tudor women sued for defamation in significant numbers. Using the church courts, which handled slander cases involving moral reputation, women of all social classes brought legal action against neighbors, former friends, business rivals, and sometimes total strangers who had said damaging things about them in public. The records of these courts, which survive in archives across England, and have been studied in detail by historians of the period, reveal something remarkable about what Tudor society considered the most damaging thing you could say about a woman. It was almost always one word, or rather one category of accusation, a charge of sexual impropriety. The suggestion that a woman had been unchaste, unfaithful, or sexually available outside the boundaries of marriage was so devastating to a Tudor woman's social and economic standing that it functioned less like an insult and more like a weapon. A targeted, deliberate instrument of harm that its users understood precisely. In London's church courts, studies of defamation cases from the Tudor and early Stuart periods show that the overwhelming majority of cases brought by women involved accusations of sexual misconduct. The specific words varied. Some were direct. Some were wrapped in the language of rumor. People are saying, "Everyone knows. I heard from a reliable source." But the core accusation was almost always the same, and the woman on the receiving end knew that if she did not act quickly to counter it, the damage would compound with every retelling. Here's why it mattered so practically, so economically, so immediately. A Tudor woman's chastity was not simply a private moral matter. It was social currency. It was the foundation of her credit, and I mean that word in both its senses. Her credit as a person of good character and her literal financial credit in the marketplace. Think about what that means in concrete terms. A woman running a small business or assisting her husband in trade depended on a network of trust with suppliers who extended goods on account, with customers who paid in advance, with neighbors who recommended her services to others. That network of trust was built partly on her reputation for honest dealing, but it was also built in Tudor England on her reputation for moral respectability. A woman whose character had been publicly questioned regardless of whether the accusation had any truth in it found that network fraying. Customers became uncertain. Suppliers became cautious. The quiet, invisible infrastructure of social trust on which her daily life depended began to shift beneath her. So she went to court, not out of wounded pride, or not only out of wounded pride, but as an act of economic self-defense. And what the courts gave her when they ruled in her favor was not just vindication. It was a public retraction. The defendant might be required to stand in church and formally withdraw the accusation to announce before the community that what they had said was false. In a world without printing presses in every home, without newspapers or public records that most people could access, where the spoken word was the primary medium of social life, a public retraction in church before the same community that had heard the original accusation was the closest thing available to setting the record straight. It was imperfect. Everyone who'd heard the original whisper did not always hear the retraction. Damage once done has a way of lingering. But the fact that women pursued these cases, sometimes at considerable financial cost and personal exposure, tells you how seriously they understood the stakes. Now, let me tell you about a case that I find particularly vivid because it illustrates not just the mechanics of defamation law, but the particular texture of how reputation worked in Tudor communities. In the records of English church courts, there are numerous cases involving what historians have called the rhyme slander accusations delivered not in plain speech, but in verse. A short rhyming couplet or verse set sometimes to a familiar tune composed about a specific individual, and then sung or recited in public places where it would be heard, repeated, and remembered. The rhyme was more dangerous than plain speech in some ways, because it was stickier. It lodged in the memory. It traveled easily past from person to person as a piece of entertainment. The identity of the target embedded in a form that people would repeat without thinking about what they were repeating. One documented case involved a woman referred to in the records as in C.P. Pings, who became the subject of exactly this kind of rhyming slander in her community. The verse composed about her circulated through the neighborhood, was sung in public spaces, and arrived at her reputation from multiple directions simultaneously. She brought a case in the church. Courts argued her character, and the historical record preserves her as someone who fought back through the available legal channels rather than absorbing the damage in silence. What strikes me about cases like hers is what they reveal about who understood power in Tudor communities. The person who composed that rhyme understood something important, that the most effective attack on a Tudor woman was not physical or financial, but reputational. That you could destabilize an entire life by destabilizing the story other people told about it. And the woman who took it to court understood something equally important in return. That the legal system, however imperfect, was a tool available to her. That silence was not her only option. That a woman could in fact speak in her own defense, provided she did so through the right channels and in the right language. That paradox is worth sitting with. Tudor society built women's reputations on the foundation of silence, on the virtues of modesty and quietness, and not drawing attention to oneself. And then when that reputation was attacked, the only way to defend it was to speak loudly in public before a court with witnesses. The system required women to be quiet until it required them not to be. Now, formal court cases were not the only mechanism at play here, because alongside the legal world of defamation suits ran a parallel and considerably older system of community reputation management, and this one was considerably less kind. It was called chivalry, or in English communities, rough music. Charave was a community ritual practiced across much of Europe from the medieval period well into the early modern era, in which a crowd would gather outside the home of someone who had violated community norms and make an enormous, deliberate, cacophonous noise, banging pots and pans, blowing horns, chanting, shouting, sometimes parading through the streets with effigies or crude costumes. The targets of chivalry in English communities varied. Husbands who were thought to be too weak or too submissive dominated by their wives in the community's judgment were sometimes subjected to it. Remarried widows whose new marriages were disapproved of. Women who had been publicly unfaithful. Men who beat their wives excessively, which tells you something interesting about how community norms actually operated as opposed to how the law operated. But for women, the shari was most commonly triggered by sexual scandal, real or alleged, and the experience of it was by any measure terrifying. A crowd outside your door, your neighbors and acquaintances, transformed into something collective and hostile. The noise designed not just to embarrass, but to break down to make the target understand physically and viscerally the weight of community disapproval. There was no legal recourse against a charivari. It was not technically illegal. It was community justice, which meant it was simultaneously the expression of real community standards and a tool that could be weaponized by anyone who wanted to mobilize a crowd against a particular woman for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. I think about the women who endured these rituals, and I'm struck by the same thing I keep being struck by across this entire story. The extraordinary emotional and psychological resilience that ordinary Tudor life required of women as a baseline condition, not as exceptional courage, just as the daily requirement of existing in that world. And yet, and here's the turn I want to make, because this is the part that gets overlooked, gossip in Tudor communities was not simply a weapon used against women. It was also a weapon used by them. Women's social networks in Tudor England were built, maintained, and activated through conversation, through the sharing of information in spaces that were predominantly female. The market, the well, the lying in chamber, the church porch after services, the informal gatherings that punctuated the rhythms of daily life. And within those networks flowed an extraordinary amount of information. Who was in financial difficulty and might need help? Who was reliable and who was not? Which merchant gave honest weight and which one cheated? Which midwife was skilled and which one you did not want in the room? Which husband in the village had a temper that his wife tried to hide? Which neighbor could be trusted with a confidence and which one could not? This was not idle chatter. It was intelligence. Operational knowledge about how to navigate the social and economic world of the community, knowledge that was accumulated, curated, and shared through exactly the conversational channels that Tudor conduct books told women to limit. A woman who was well connected in her community's female networks knew things. And knowing things in Tudor England, as in any society, was a form of power, soft power, the kind that does not announce itself, that does not sit at the table where formal decisions are made, but that shapes the environment in which those decisions happen. The woman at the market, who knew which families were struggling financially, could steer business toward those she wanted to support and away from those she did not. The woman at the church porch, who was trusted with information, could choose what to repeat and what to hold. The woman in the lying in chamber, present at one of the most vulnerable moments of another woman's life, accumulated a kind of intimacy-based influence that had no formal name, but was understood by everyone in the community. Tudor society tried to frame women's talk as trivial, as gossip in the dismissive sense, as the harmless chatter of people who were not involved in anything that really mattered. But the conduct books that warned against women talking too much, and there were many of them from Thomas More's circle to the Protestant reformers who followed, were not warning against something trivial. They were warning against something they understood to be genuinely influential. You do not spend decades writing books telling women to be quiet if you genuinely believe their speech has no effect. The anxiety about women's voices was in its own way a compliment. And this is what I keep coming back to as the Thruff in a Part 7 reputation in Tudor England was the terrain on which the contest between official rules and actual female power was fought most visibly and most constantly. Officially, a woman's reputation was built in silence and maintained by invisibility. In practice, women built and defended their reputations through active, skilled, strategically deployed speech in courts and community networks, and the careful management of who knew what about them and when. The rule said, be quiet. The world they actually lived in required something more complicated. And the women who navigated it most successfully were the ones who understood both who could perform the silence when the silence was required, and who knew exactly when and where and how loudly to speak. Now, everything we have explored so far, the education, the marriage, the childbirth, the widowhood, the reputation has been about women navigating a world they largely did not control, finding spaces within a structure they did not design. But there were women in Tudor England who existed inside yet another kind of structure entirely. Women who lived closest to power, who slept in the same palaces as queens, who dressed and attended the most powerful women in the land, whose daily lives were shaped by proximity to royalty, the ladies in waiting. And their world, the gilded, surveilled, intensely political world of the royal court, had its own set of unwritten rules that were in some ways the most demanding of all. That is the world we are stepping into right now, in Part 8. And I promise you, the court had secrets that would make your head spin. YouTube storytelling. Foreign. For tomorrow. Second part. The golden facade of Roman luxury. For YouTube. Hey YouTube channel. Map covered content and plan fresh angles for part-time on ladies in waiting. Map covered content and plan fresh angles for part-time on ladies in waiting to go. Quan Hat to Jane Boland Dorothy Stafford. Let's talk about the most coveted job in Tudor England that nobody in their right mind should have wanted. That sounds like a contradiction, and honestly it is. But that contradiction is precisely what makes the world of Tudor court ladies so endlessly fascinating and so quietly terrifying. To serve in the household of a Tudor queen was considered one of the greatest honors a family of any standing could achieve for their daughter. Fathers wrote letters called in debts of friendship, petitioned powerful intermediaries, and occasionally humiliated themselves in quite spectacular ways to secure a position for their girl. Mothers coached their daughters for months in preparation. The competition for a place in the Queen's chambers was real, fierce, and sometimes deeply undignified for a social class that prided itself on dignity above almost everything else. And yet the women who actually held those positions, who lived inside the palaces, who slept steps from the most powerful woman in England, who dressed and attended and accompanied the Queen through every hour of her day, those women knew something that the ambitious families outside did not always fully reckon with. Proximity to power in Tudor England was not only privilege, it was exposure. The closer you were to the center, the more you saw, and the more you saw, the more dangerous it became to have seen it. Let us start with what the job actually was, because I think the image many people carry of a lady in waiting, a graceful woman gliding through candle-lit corridors, playing music, and attending banquets, is about 20% accurate and 80% wishful thinking. The Tudor Queen's household was a functioning institution with a clear hierarchy, specific roles, and daily responsibilities that were considerably less glamorous than the title suggested. At the top sat the great ladies, usually the wives of the most senior noblemen in the kingdom, women of such high status that their presence in the Queen's household was itself a political statement, about which families the crown considered its allies. These women held titles like Lady of the Bedchamber or Chief Lady of the Privy Chamber, and their duties were largely ceremonial. They appeared at formal occasions. They sat with the Queen during audiences. They managed the household's most senior operations. They attended in the Tudor sense of the word, which meant being physically present, bearing witness to the Queen's daily life as a form of social validation. Below them came the gentle women of the Privy Chamber and the Presence Chamber women of good, but not necessarily noble birth daughters of the gentry, and the wealthier merchant classes whose families had managed to secure them positions through connection petition or simply being in the right place at the right moment. These women did considerably more actual work. They accompanied the Queen on walks and rides. They read aloud during meals. They played music when it was wanted. They carried messages. They managed the flow of people seeking access to the Queen. They were in modern terms a combination of personal assistant, social secretary, and human shield. And at the base of the hierarchy, the chambers were women who handled the most intimate physical aspects of daily royal life. The dressing and undressing, the hair, the care of the Queen's clothing and jewelry, the management of her private chambers, the tasks that required not just efficiency, but absolute discretion, because they were performed in the spaces where the Queen was most herself, least curated, most human. Now, here's what strikes me when I think about these three tiers of service and the women who inhabited them. The woman with the most ceremonial status, the great lady at the top of the hierarchy, had the most visibility and the most political weight. But in terms of actual intimate knowledge of the Queen's life, her moods, her health, her fears, her secrets, it was the chambers at the bottom who knew the most. They were there when the Queen was tired and irritable and said things she would not say in public. They were there when she was unwell. They were there when the private reality of her life diverged from the public performance of it. They saw everything, and they were expected to say nothing. That expectation, see everything say nothing, survive was the most fundamental, unwritten rule of court service. And it was enforced not by any written code, but by the entirely visible consequences that befell those who broke it. Can I ask you something? If you had access to information that the most powerful man in England wanted very badly, information that could potentially save your life or end someone else's, what would you do with it? I ask, because that was not a hypothetical question for Tudor court ladies. It was the actual lived reality of some of them, and the answers they gave shaped not only their own fates, but the course of English history. Jane Boleyn was a lady in waiting of considerable experience by the time her story reached its most consequential chapter. She had served at the Tudor court for years. She had watched the rise and fall of her own sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn. She had survived it, which was in the atmosphere of Henry VII court in the 1530s. No small thing. Jane Boleyn, who held the title Lady Rowford through her marriage to Anne's brother, George, appears in the historical record as one of the witnesses in the investigation that led to and Boleyn's downfall in 1536. The precise nature of what she said and why she said it has been debated by historians for centuries. What is clear is that she gave testimony at a moment of extreme political danger when the forces arrayed against Anne Boleyn were moving with deliberate speed, and when any woman who failed to provide the information that those forces wanted risked being swept away in the same current. Was Jane Boleyn, calculating, frightened, genuinely convinced of what she was saying, coerced in ways that the formal record does not capture? Probably some combination of all of those things, because that is usually the honest answer when we ask why people in terrible situations made the choices they made. It is rarely pure villain or pure innocence. It is usually the complicated human arithmetic of someone trying to survive inside a system that has decided to consume someone near them. Jane Boleyn survived 1536. She continued to serve at court in the households of subsequent queens. She was present in the household of Catherine Howard Henry VIII's fifth wife, a young woman who came to court with her own complicated history and her own dangerous secrets. And then Jane Boleyn's story reached its end in 1542 when she was executed alongside Catherine Howard. She was 50-some years old. She had spent decades navigating the most dangerous political environment in England with enough skill to survive what had killed several women around her. She did not survive this. I dwell on Jane Boleyn not because I think her story is simple, it absolutely is not, but because she illustrates something essential about the world of Tudor court ladies. The knowledge that came with proximity to power could not be neatly managed. It could not be filed away and ignored. It had a way of demanding something from the person who held it, and the demands it made were not always ones that anyone could meet with their integrity and their life both intact. Let us move to someone whose story ended differently, because the court was not only a place where women were destroyed, it was also for the right woman with the right skills, a place where remarkable longevity was possible. Dorothy Stafford served Elizabeth I as a gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber for the better part of 40 years. 40 years in a court where political fortune shifted constantly, where the Queen's favor could evaporate overnight, where families rose and fell with a speed that made the head spin. Dorothy Stafford simply kept serving. She was there in the early years of Elizabeth's reign, when everything was new and uncertain. She was there at the middle when the Elizabethan court was in its full magnificence. She was still there near the end when the Queen was aging and the court had begun its long, complicated process of looking toward the next reign. How does a woman survive 40 years of the Tudor court? What are the skills? What is the temperament? From what the historical record suggests about Dorothy Stafford, the answer involves a particular combination of genuine competence, absolute reliability, and a very well-developed sense of when to be visible and when to be invisible. She was trusted with the Queen's private correspondence at various points. She was a presence in the chamber during moments of royal vulnerability that could have been exploited and were not. She managed relationships within the court with enough skill that she accumulated allies rather than enemies over decades of service. She was not famous in the way that the politically dramatic women of the period were famous. She did not shape policy or survive a fall from grace or write memorable letters that historians have analyzed ever since. She did something that Tudor culture actually required and rarely rewarded publicly. She was steadfastly, reliably present, and she kept the secret she was trusted to keep. There is a kind of mastery in that which I find genuinely impressive. Not the mastery of the chess player who sees 12 moves ahead. The mastery of the long game player who understands that the most important quality in a place where everything is volatile is the ability to remain calm. Now I want to talk about something that the official accounts of court service almost never discuss directly, but that shaped the daily reality of every woman who served in the Queen's household. The physical intimacy of the work. A chamberer who dressed the Queen each morning touched her. She combed her hair, laced her gowns, helped her in and out of the layers of clothing that a Tudor Queen wore. She was present for the Queen's morning routine in a way that required a kind of physical familiarity that in any other social context would have been considered extraordinary. You did not touch people of higher status in Tudor England. It was a breach of social protocol, a violation of the careful distances that hierarchy maintained. And yet the women who served in the most intimate roles of the Queen's household did exactly that every day as their primary professional function. This created a particular kind of relationship, not friendship exactly, and certainly not equality, but something that had elements of both and fit neatly into neither category. Queens could be brutal in their dismissal of ladies they had grown tired of, and the power differential was never entirely absent. But queens could also form genuine attachments to the women who served the most closely. Attachments built on the intimacy of physical care and daily proximity that cut across the formal hierarchy in ways that both parties understood and neither party could quite acknowledge publicly. Elizabeth I is well known for her fierce, sometimes explosive attachments to the women around her. She could be devastatingly cold to a lady who displeased her, refusing to speak to her, dismissing her from court, cutting off access to the royal presence, which in practical terms cut off access to influence, patronage, and the social oxygen of court life. And she could be warmly, almost possessively attached to those she favored, showering them with gifts and public demonstrations of affection that made clear to everyone watching exactly where the royal preference lay. The women who serve Elizabeth learned to read those moods with extraordinary precision. They learned through experience and sometimes painful error the geography of the queen's emotional landscape, where the solid ground was where the surface could give way without warning. They developed an almost clinical attention to the queen's voice, her posture, the particular quality of her silence that distinguished contemplation from displeasure. And then there were the women who served at court, not primarily out of family strategy or financial necessity, but because the court itself offered something available nowhere else: the chance to be educated at the highest level in contact with the most intellectually stimulating people in England, at the center of events that would shape the country for generations. For some Tudor women, the court was less a gilded cage than a very expensive, very dangerous school, and they took what education they could from it as long as they could, and they applied it in ways that their families had not entirely anticipated. And Bassett is one of those women, a daughter of Honor Lyle and her first husband, and spent years navigating the competitive business of securing and maintaining a place at court, appearing in the households of multiple queens across the turbulent years of the 1530s and 4s. Her mother's letters, preserved in the Lyle Letters collection, give an extraordinary window into exactly how much family effort and anxiety went into the project of keeping a daughter at court. The clothing required, the gifts that had to be made to the right people, the constant calibration of how much to press for advancement and when to hold back, the monitoring from a distance of whether and was making the right alliances and avoiding the wrong ones. What the letters reveal, and what I find quietly heartbreaking and quietly funny in equal measure, is the gap between the mother's anxious management of his court career and the reality of and being an adult woman in a complex environment, making her own judgments, forming her own relationships, navigating her own path through a world that her mother could see only from the outside. That gap exists in every generation between parents who want to manage their children's lives and children who are living those lives themselves. But in Tudor England, where the stakes of getting it wrong at court could be genuinely life-altering, that gap had a very particular charge to it. The unwritten rules of court service asked Tudor women to perform a very precise kind of existence, to be present without being intrusive, to be observant without being seen to observe, to be useful without demanding recognition for that usefulness, to hold information without being defined by it, to serve a powerful woman with loyalty, while understanding that the loyalty might not be returned with equal measure, and that the day might come when survival required a different calculation entirely. Most of them managed it day after day, year after year, in the particular quiet way that history does not record, because history tends to notice the dramatic moments and miss the thousands of ordinary ones that surround them. But behind the court, behind the palaces and the ceremonies and the dangerous proximity to royal power, there was another institution that shaped Tudor women's lives just as profoundly. One that operated in every village and town in England, that governed not just behavior, but thought, not just action, but belief. The church and the church's relationship with Tudor women, the ways it constrained them, the ways it paradoxically empowered them, and the extraordinary things that happened when religious upheaval sent the entire framework into chaos. That is a story that deserves its own full chapter, which is exactly where we are headed right now. Something happened in Tudor England that no one had quite planned for. The Reformation, that enormous crashing wave of religious change that Henry VIII set in motion in the 1530s, and that continued reshaping English life for decades afterward, was supposed to be about theology, about the authority of the Pope, about the nature of sacraments, and the proper interpretation of Scripture, about who got to stand between a Christian soul and God. What nobody seems to have fully anticipated was how much of that debate would be conducted by women. Not in Parliament, not in the universities, not from pulpits. Tudor women were not permitted to preach, and that rule held firm across Catholic and Protestant England alike. But in households and private correspondence in the margins of books, in the extraordinary act of reading Scripture for themselves, and in a handful of cases that shook Tudor society to its foundations, in public acts of faith so visible and so costly that they changed the historical record permanently. Let us start with something that often gets overlooked in the larger drama of the English Reformation. The religious life that Tudor women had built for themselves inside the old Catholic Church before the upheaval began. Because understanding what they lost is essential to understanding why the religious changes of the Tudor period cut so deeply for so many women. Before the Reformation, the Catholic Church offered women something the secular world largely withheld: structured opportunities to lead. Parish guilds, the religious fraternal organizations attached to local churches that managed charitable work, maintained altars, organized feast days, and provided a form of community welfare, admitted women as members in many English parishes. Women appeared in guild records as donors, organizers, and in some cases as wardens responsible for managing guild finances and activities. These were not positions of vast power, but they were positions of genuine community responsibility, recognized publicly, documented formally, operating outside the domestic sphere. Women made pious bequests in their wills, leaving money for prayers to be said, for candles to be maintained before particular saints, for the upkeep of altars. These bequests were not simply devotional gestures. They were acts of agency, choices made about where resources went and what legacies endured. The surviving wills of Tudor women from the early 16th century show in aggregate a picture of women actively participating in the management of their spiritual and community environment. And then there were the pilgrimages. Pilgrimage in pre-Reformation England was one of the few forms of travel available to women that was socially sanctioned and even respected. A woman traveling to the shrine of a Saint Singham, Canterbury, Glastonbury. The dozens of local shrines that dotted the English landscape was not wandering unmed from her proper sphere. She was fulfilling a religious duty, one that gave her legitimate reason to move through the world, to encounter strangers, to manage her own journey for days or weeks at a time. The Reformation dismantled most of this. Henry VIII commissioners moved through England in the 1530s and 40s, systematically closing the monasteries and convents, dissolving the parish guilds, suppressing the shrines, removing the relics, and redirecting the wealth of centuries of devotion into the royal treasury. The shrines at Walsingham and Canterbury, among the most visited in England, were stripped. The holy objects were melted down or confiscated. The structures were demolished or repurposed for the women whose devotional lives have been organized around these institutions and these practices. It was not simply a religious disruption. It was the removal of the scaffolding that had given their community participation shape and legitimacy. But here is the paradox that makes the Tudor Reformation so complicated when you look at it through the lens of women's lives. Specifically, Protestant theology as it developed across the 16th century actually contained within it a more egalitarian view of spiritual capacity than Catholic tradition had formally articulated. The Protestant emphasis on Scripture as the direct Word of God accessible to every believer, and the accompanying push to make the Bible available in English so that ordinary people could read it for themselves, was in theory a leveling act. It said that the intermediaries between a soul and God, the priests, the hierarchy, the institutional church, were less essential than direct personal engagement with Scripture. A woman who could read English could now, for the first time, sit alone with the Word of God and interpret it for herself. That was genuinely radical. In the context of Tudor England, where women's intellectual and spiritual authority had been systematically curtailed by centuries of institutional practice, the Protestant Vernacular Bible was a revolutionary document. and some Tudor women understood this with absolute clarity. Mildred Cook, who married William Cecil, the man who had become Elizabeth I's closest advisor, was one of the most learned women in mid-Tudor England. She read Greek. She translated works from Greek into English. She engaged with theological questions with a seriousness and sophistication that her contemporaries, when they acknowledged it at all, framed as remarkable rather than natural. She used her position in one of the most politically connected households in England to support Protestant scholars, influence the religious education of her children, and shape in quiet, but consequential ways the intellectual environment of the Elizabethan court. Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, went further. She was publicly, vocally, unapologetically Protestant at a time when public vocal Protestant opinion was not without its dangers. She had a pet spaniel that she named Gardner after Stephen Gardner, the Bishop of Winchester, and one of the most prominent Catholic figures in Henry VII later court. She let the dog run through her house. People talked about it. She did not appear to mind. That is a very particular kind of defiance. Small enough to be deniable, visible enough to be unmistakable, wrapped in the entirely plausible cover of simply owning a pet with an inconvenient name. Tudor women, as we've seen over and over again across these hours together, develop a very sophisticated understanding of the difference between those two categories. Now, I want to tell you about two women whose stories represent the extreme ends of what faith could ask of a Tudor woman and what it could cost. The first is Elizabeth Barton. Elizabeth Barton was a young woman from Kent, a servant of no particularly elevated birth or education, who in the early 1520s began experiencing what she and those around her described as religious visions. She fell into trances. She spoke prophecies. She described revelations concerning the spiritual state of those who came to hear her. And her reputation spread with remarkable speed through Kent and eventually to London itself. The church investigated her and unusually endorsed her. She became known as the Holy Maid of Kent, was received by Cardinal Wolsey, was permitted to enter a convent, was heard by bishops and abbots and men of the highest ecclesiastical standing in England. At a time when women were specifically excluded from any formal religious authority, Elizabeth Barton had found a door that was technically not closed, the category of the mystic, the visionary, the vessel of direct divine communication. It was a narrow door, and it had very specific conditions attached to it. The condition was that her visions should not contradict royal policy. When Elizabeth Barton's visions began to address Henry VIII's plan to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, when she began prophesying publicly that if the king proceeded with his plan, God's punishment would follow, she had stepped through the narrow door and into a space that Tudor power could not tolerate. She was arrested in 1533. Under what pressure, in what circumstances, with what promises or threats the record does not fully tell us. But she confessed that her visions had been fabricated. She was publicly humiliated, forced to recant at St. Paul's Cross in London before a large crowd. And in April of 1534, she was executed. She was in her late 20s. Elizabeth Barton had found what seemed like a legitimate channel for female spiritual authority, had it formally recognized by the church, and discovered that legitimate channels in Tudor England were legitimate only until they became inconvenient to the people who had authorized them. The second story belongs to Anascu. Anascu was a Lincolnshire gentlewoman literate and intellectually engaged who became one of the most committed Protestant reformers of Henry VIII's later reign at a period when the king's religious policy was oscillating in ways that made any strong doctrinal position potentially dangerous and specific disagreement with official doctrine centered on the nature of the Eucharist, on whether the bread and wine of communion were physically transformed into the body and blood of Christ as Catholic, teaching held, or whether the communion was a symbolic act, as Protestant reformers argued. This was not a minor theological quibble in the 1540s. It was the kind of doctrinal position that determined quite literally whether you lived or died, and asked you chose to die for it. She was arrested, interrogated, and subjected to torture in the Tower of London in 1546, an act that was itself technically illegal, as it was generally accepted that gentlewomen should not be put to the rack. She was racked anyway. She was asked to name other Protestants, particularly women of the court, including ladies close to the Queen Catherine Parr, whose faith she had knowledge of. She refused to give names, through sessions that left her physically unable to walk. She did not give them the names. She was carried to her execution at Smithfield in July of 1546 on a chair because she could not stand. She was 25 years old. I want to sit with Anasku's story for a moment and resist the temptation to flatten it into simple heroism, because I think she deserves more than that. What Anissa did was intellectually deliberate and theologically rigorous. She had studied scripture. She had formed her positions through genuine engagement with the text and the arguments. When she was interrogated by some of the most educated churchmen in England, she answered them in their own theological language with a precision that her examiners found remarkable and infuriating in roughly equal measure. Several of the records of her examination survive because she herself wrote them down, created a first-person account of her own interrogations that circulated as Protestant literature almost immediately after her death. She was not simply brave. She was articulate. She was prepared. She knew exactly what she was doing and exactly what it would cost. And she chose it anyway. That combination of intellectual seriousness and absolute moral commitment is something Tudor society spent considerable energy telling women they were incapable of. Anaska made her answer to that claim in the only language Tudor England could not ignore. Now on the opposite end of the faith spectrum from Anasku, there were the Catholic recent women. Those who maintained their Catholic faith after the Elizabethan religious settlement made Protestantism the official religion of England at increasing legal and financial cost. Recusancy, the refusal to attend the services of the Church of England, was a crime under Elizabethan law. Fines were levied. More serious penalties could follow. And the practical work of maintaining a Catholic household with its secret masses and hidden priests and carefully managed appearances of outward conformity fell very substantially on women, because women were, in the eyes of Elizabeth and law, legally subordinate to their husbands. A husband could be held responsible for his wife's recency, or he could claim ignorance of practices conducted in the domestic sphere that was officially her domain. The same cover that stripped women of legal agency in so many areas of their lives gave Catholic families a certain flexibility in deciding who officially bore responsibility for religious practice within the household. Women managed the hiding places, the priest holes that families like the Trahams and the Vauxes built into their manor houses. They organized the schedules of visiting priests. They maintained the networks of communication between Catholic families that kept the recusant community connected and relatively informed. They educated their children in the faith in nurseries and private rooms, passing down practices that were now officially illegal. They did all of this while presenting in public a face of sufficient compliance to avoid the most severe consequences of the law. It was exhausting work. It required a sustained performance of one thing while doing another day after day across years and decades. But it was work that these women understood as essential as the preservation of something that mattered more than personal safety. And here's what I find most striking when I hold an Askew and the recusant women in the same frame. These women were on opposite sides of the great religious divide of the 16th century. Their theologies were incompatible. Their practices were mutually exclusive. In some contexts, they would have been each other's enemies. But the structure of what they were doing was remarkably similar. Both groups were women who had taken their faith seriously enough to act on it in ways that the official world around them did not sanction. Both had found in religion a source of authority and conviction that did not depend on the permission of husbands, fathers, or institutions. Both were doing in their different ways what Tudor society had always been vaguely afraid of living, according to a set of values that they had formed themselves from their own engagement with the questions that mattered most regardless of what the rules around them said. Tudor society tried to give women a relationship with God that was mediated, managed, and safely contained within approved channels. And what the religious history of the Tudor period shows over and over again is that for a significant number of women, faith refused to stay in its assigned lane. Which brings me to the most famous woman in all of Tudor England. The one who took every rule, every expectation, every unwritten law we have discussed across these 9 chapters, and spent 45 years of her reign doing something genuinely unprecedented with them. Elizabeth I and her story, the specific, fascinating, historically grounded story of how she navigated being a woman at the top of a world built entirely by and for men, is one of the most layered things I've ever tried to tell. So, let's take it carefully, which starts right now. Every rule has an exception, and in Tudor England, in that entire elaborate, carefully constructed world of unwritten expectations about what women were, what they were for, and what they were capable of, the exception had red hair, a quick temper, and a political mind so sharp that even her enemies spent decades struggling to find its edges. Elizabeth I. But here's what I want to do with this part of the story, because I think the popular version of Elizabeth gets something important wrong. The popular version presents her as a woman ahead of her time, a proto-feminist who broke free of the limitations around her through some combination of exceptional intelligence and sheer force of will. And while she was certainly exceptional, and while the intelligence and the will were very real, that framing misses something. Something that I think is actually more interesting. Elizabeth did not break free of Tudor society's rules about women. She did something far more sophisticated and far more revealing. She mastered those rules so completely that she was able to use them as tools, turning the expectations of her world against themselves, wielding the language of female weakness to project political strength, performing submission in ways that accumulated power. To understand how she did it, you have to understand where she started. Elizabeth's childhood was not the gilded beginning that a future queen might seem to require. She came into the world in September of 1533 as the daughter of Henry VIII and in Berlin, the child whose birth had disappointed a king who had moved heaven earth and the entire English church in order to marry her mother and produce a son. She was declared legitimate. Then, when her mother was executed in 1536, Elizabeth was not quite 3 years old. She was declared illegitimate. Her status oscillated with the political weather. She grew up understanding something that most children are protected from, understanding that the ground beneath her could shift at any moment, that the love and recognition of the most powerful person in her world was not a given, but a calculation subject to revision. That is not a small thing to learn at the age of 2.5, and I think it explains a great deal about the woman she became. By the time Elizabeth was a teenager, she'd already experienced more political instability than most people encountered in a lifetime. She'd watched 2 of her father's wives go to the scaffold. She'd been restored to the succession and removed from it. She had navigated the religious reversals of her father's later reign, the short and reforming reign of her brother Edward V, and then the Catholic restoration under her sister Mary, the first under whom in 1554 Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London for nearly 2 months on suspicion of involvement in a Protestant rebellion. The tower where her mother had been held before her execution, where other members of her family had been imprisoned and sometimes killed. Elizabeth walked into it, sat in it, and walked out of it alive. How she managed that the precise calibration of what to say, what to deny, what to admit, how much apparent cooperation to offer without providing anything genuinely incriminating is one of the more remarkable performances of political survival in the Tudor period. She was 20 years old. By the time she became queen in November of 1558, Elizabeth had been educated in the school of genuine danger. She knew in a way that no theoretical training could have taught her exactly what was at stake in the game of power. And she knew from personal, visceral, remembered experience exactly what happened to women who played it badly. Now she was queen, and the moment she became queen, the rules began pressing in on her from every direction. The most insistent and the most exhausting was the marriage question. Almost immediately after her accession, Parliament, the Privy Council, foreign ambassadors, domestic noblemen, and every commentator with a pen in hand began urging, advising, petitioning, and eventually demanding that Elizabeth marry. The reasoning was presented as purely practical. She needed an heir. Without an heir, the succession was uncertain. An uncertain succession meant potential civil war, foreign invasion, the unraveling of everything the Tudor dynasty had built. All of that was true. The concern was not irrational, but buried inside the practical argument was another argument less openly stated, but clearly understood by everyone in the room. A woman alone at the head of a nation was inherently incomplete. She needed a husband to govern alongside her, or more precisely to govern through her. The natural order as Tudor England conceived it required a male authority at the top of every hierarchy from the household to the kingdom. John Knox, the Scottish Protestant reformer, had written a pamphlet in 1558 conveniently published the same year Elizabeth came to the throne, which must have been spectacularly bad timing from his perspective, titled The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. In it, he argued with considerable vigor that female rule was unnatural, contrary to Scripture, and an offense against God's established order. He had been writing primarily about Mary I and Mary, Queen of Scots, both Catholic monarchs he despised, but the title did not specify which women he found monstrous. And Elizabeth's succession put him in the awkward position of having just published a comprehensive argument against the legitimacy of the person who was now the Protestant queen he needed on his side. Elizabeth never forgave him for it. For the rest of his life, she refused him access to England. Not loudly, not with a public denunciation. Simply no. The door remained closed. She was good at that. But Knox's pamphlet articulated something that many people in 1558 believed without being willing to say quite so bluntly, and Elizabeth spent the next 45 years answering it. Her answer was layered and brilliant, and took different forms in different contexts. I want to focus on two specific tools she used because I think they reveal the most about how she understood the rules she was working within. The first tool was the doctrine of the two bodies. Medieval political theology, building on ideas that were well established by the Tudor period, held that a monarch possessed two distinct bodies. The natural body, the physical, mortal, fallible human being subject to illness, age, death, and the ordinary limitations of flesh. And the political body, the immortal, symbolic, institutional body of the crown itself, which transcended the individual and continued regardless of what happened to the natural person wearing it. Elizabeth used this doctrine with extraordinary precision. When her gender was raised as an objection, when Parliament pressed the marriage question by arguing that a woman could not govern alone, that England needed a king, Elizabeth separated her natural body from her political one. As a natural woman, she might be weak. She might need protection. She might be subject to the frailties that Tudor society attributed to female nature. She was willing to say this. She said it herself in public more than once, but as the holder of the political body of the English crown, as the anointed monarch chosen by God, invested with the full authority of the realm, she was no more limited by her sex than her father had been limited by his. The two bodies let her agree with her critics about women in general, while insisting on her own specific exception. It was in its way a perfectly designed rhetorical trap. You could not argue against it without either denying the doctrine of royal authority, which nobody wanted to do, or admitting that the general rules about women did not apply to her, which was exactly her point. The second tool was considerably more theatrical. Elizabeth I understood something about image that was genuinely ahead of her time, that a monarch who controls the story people tell about them controls something more durable than any military victory or diplomatic triumph, and she invested in that control with a dedication that modern public relations professionals would find entirely familiar. The cult of the Virgin Queen was not something that simply happened to Elizabeth. It was constructed deliberately over years with input from artists and poets and court ceremonial designers, and the Queen herself, who took an active interest in how she was represented that went well beyond vanity. The portraits from the later years of her reign are extraordinary documents, if you know how to read them. Elizabeth in her 40s, 50s, 60s, aging in reality as everybody ages, but presented in official portraiture with the face of a timeless, ageless figure, the mask of youth, as art historians have called it, a stylized, flattened representation of the royal face that became increasingly disconnected from the living person as the reign progressed, and was increasingly applied to canvases with a consistency that bordered on iconic. The white face paint that Elizabeth wore in her later years, lead-based, genuinely toxic, slowly damaging the skin it was meant to beautify, served the same function as the portraits. It was a mask worn on the living body that maintained the fiction of an ageless sovereign. She was not hiding her age out of vanity in the ordinary sense. She was protecting the political mythology that her continued rule depended on. An old woman visibly aging was a reminder of mortality of succession, of the questions that gathered around a monarch without an heir. An ageless icon was none of those things, and the specific myth she had chosen, the Virgin Queen, chaste and whole, and belonging to no man, was itself a masterwork of political theology. By remaining unmarried, Elizabeth had done something that should theoretically have been her greatest weakness and transformed it into a form of power. She belonged to no husband. She was not covered in the legal sense. She was not absorbed into any man's authority. She was uniquely in Tudor England, a woman who was simultaneously the most powerful person in the country and the holder of her own legal identity. And the Virgin Queen mythology gave that political reality a sacred framing. She was not just unmarried. She was wed to England. She was her people's mother. The language of religious devotion, the imagery borrowed from the cult of the Virgin Mary, which the Reformation had officially suppressed, but which the English cultural memory retained with remarkable persistence, was redirected toward Elizabeth herself. Do I think she planned all of this from the beginning? Honestly, no. I think it evolved. I think the decision not to marry, whatever its original motivations, whether strategic or personal or both, accumulated its mythology gradually, each year, adding another layer to a construct that eventually became self-sustaining. But I do think she understood what she was building, at least by the middle years of her reign, and I think she tended it with conscious care. Now, here's the question I promised to address, the one that I find genuinely difficult and that I think deserves a careful answer. Did Elizabeth I believe in women's equality? The historical evidence suggests that the honest answer is probably not in any sense we would recognize today. She referred to herself in speeches and letters as a weak woman. She acknowledged her own sex as a limitation in specific rhetorical contexts in ways that she clearly thought advantageous. But that also reflects genuine internalized beliefs. She was, as one historian put it, deeply invested in being the exception rather than the rule, which implicitly validated the rule itself. She appointed no women to her privy council. She relied on male advisors entirely for the management of state affairs. She expressed at various points skepticism about women's capacity for certain kinds of judgment. And yet she ruled for 45 years. She managed the most complex political landscape in Europe with a skill that left her contemporaries alternately admiring and baffled. She navigated religious divisions that had torn other countries apart. She outmaneuvered foreign rulers who assumed at the beginning that she would be manageable. She was not a feminist, but she was proof, and proof in the right historical moment has a way of doing more work than theory. I want to close this part of our story with a moment that I think about often. It is the summer of 1588. The Spanish Armada, the largest naval force Europe had seen in generations, is in the English Channel. England is facing the genuine possibility of invasion of conquest of the replacement of the Protestant settlement with Catholic rule under Spanish authority. Elizabeth rides to Tilbury to the camp where her land forces are assembled, and she gives a speech. The speech has been reconstructed from accounts written shortly afterward, and historians debate exactly which words are precisely original. But the core of it, the line that has echoed across the centuries, was this: I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England, too. That line is doing several things simultaneously, and every one of them is deliberate. She acknowledges the weakness. She cons the gender. She gives the critics, the John Knoxes, the parliamentarians, the foreign rulers who had spent 30 years insisting she needed a husband the very admission they had always demanded. And then she takes it and turns it completely upside down. The body may be weak, but the will, the political identity, the anointed authority, the heart and stomach, as she called them, those belong to a king, to England's king, and they are hers. It is the two bodies doctrine delivered in a field to an army in the plain English of a woman who had spent 45 years learning exactly how to say what needed to be said. The Armada was defeated partly by English naval tactics, partly by storms, and partly in the story that England told itself afterward, and that Elizabeth cultivated carefully by a queen who had stood before her people and refused to be reduced to the limitations of her body. Which brings us to a question that has been waiting in the background of this entire story, growing more insistent with every part we've traveled through together. What happened to all of this? What became of the unwritten rules? The women who bent? Them, the extraordinary individuals who found ways to carve out lives of meaning and agency inside a system designed to contain them. And more pointedly and more uncomfortably, what is the distance really between Tudor England and the world we're sitting in right now? I think it is the most important part of this whole journey. So stay with me just a little further. Let me tell you about a word you use every day without knowing where it came from. Spinster. Today, it carries a particular weight. A slightly outdated, slightly unkind label for a woman who has never married. You can hear the faint judgment in it even now, the implication of someone left behind, unchosen, incomplete. But the word did not start that way. It started as a job title. In Tudor England, a spinster was simply a woman who spun, who took raw wool or flax, and using a daff and spindle, twisted into the thread that would eventually be woven into cloth. It was honest, skilled, essential work. England's cloth trade was one of the most economically significant industries in the entire Tudor economy. Wool exports had built the wealth of English merchants and landowners for centuries. And at the base of that industry, before the thread ever reached a loom with the women who spun it, spinning was so thoroughly associated with women that it became the default occupation recorded for any unmarried woman in legal documents. If a court needed to describe a woman's occupation, and she had no other specific trade recorded against her name, the Clare wrote spinster, not as an insult, as a descriptor, as the job that women did. And then gradually the word shifted. The occupation became the status. The woman who spun became the woman who had not married. And somewhere in that shift, somewhere between the 16th and 18th centuries, the honest economic reality of women's work was quietly swallowed by a social judgment about their marital situation. That small etymology carries, I think, the entire story of Tudor women's economic lives in miniature. The work was real. The contribution was essential, and the cultural memory of it transformed almost entirely into something about what those women had failed to achieve. Let's talk about what they actually built. The Tudor economy ran in significant part on female labor, not metaphorically, not in the abstract, in the specific documented quantifiable sense that entire industries depended on women's work for their basic functioning. And the story of how those industries operated, and then over the course of the 16th century, how women were systematically edged out of the formal recognition and economic reward that their labor had been generating, is one of the more uncomfortable chapters in this history. Start with ale. Before the Tudor period, and well into its early decades, the production of ale for local consumption was predominantly a female enterprise. The Alu wife was a fixture of English village and town life. A woman who brewed ale in her home and sold it to her neighbors, operating under a license from the local authorities subject to the tasting and oversight of ale conners, who checked that her product met local standards of quality and price. Why women? Because brewing ale was a natural extension of the household work that women already performed. It required the same equipment used for cooking. It drew on knowledge of grain storage, water management, and the specific herbal additions, not hops in the early period, but a mixture of herbs called grut that gave the ale its flavor and preservative qualities. It fitted into the rhythms of domestic production, and it generated income that flowed into the household economy alongside everything else the woman was managing. This was not a small-scale, marginal activity. In some English towns in the late medieval and early Tudor period, women made up the majority of registered brewers. Records from Oxford and from various market towns across England show women's names appearing repeatedly in brewing accounts, in licensing records and the court documents generated when disputes arose over quality or price. And then the industry changed. The introduction of hopped beer from the Low Countries beginning in the 15th century and accelerating through the 16th transformed brewing from a small-scale household enterprise into something that could be done at scale, stored for longer periods, and traded over greater distances. Larger capital investment was required, larger equipment, more complex logistics, and with greater scale and greater capital came the guilds. The brewing guilds that consolidated across English towns during the Tudor period were organized, regulated, and dominated by men. They set standards, controlled access to markets, and determined who could legally produce for sale. The informal authority of the alewife, built on local reputation, personal relationships, and decades of practical knowledge, did not translate into guild membership. The economic infrastructure that men built around the industry they were taking over did not include, as a structural feature, the women who'd been central to it before. By the end of the 16th century, commercial brewing in English towns was predominantly male. The wives had not disappeared. Small-scale household production continued, particularly in rural areas, but the profitable, formally recognized, institutionally protected center of the industry, had moved, and it had moved without them. This pattern, women dominating a productive activity, capital and organization arriving guilds, formalizing women excluded, repeated itself across multiple trades in Tudor England, and nowhere is it documented more clearly than in the story of London's silk women. The silk women of London were something genuinely remarkable. From at least the 14th century, women in London have been central to the silk trade, not as spinners of raw thread, but as skilled craftsmen who worked the imported silk into ribbons, braids, fringes, and the elaborate decorative textiles that dressed the nobility and wealthy merchants of England. They trained apprentices. They ran workshops. They sold directly to customers, including royal customers. In 1433, the silk women of London petitioned Parliament, directly a remarkable act for any group of commoners in that period, let alone women requesting protection against cheaper imported goods that were undercutting their domestic production. Parliament listened. A protective act was passed. These women had enough economic weight, enough organized presence, enough understood importance to the trade that the legislative body of England responded to their request. By the late Tudor period, the silk trade had been absorbed into male-dominated guild structures. The silk women did not disappear overnight. Their skills were too specialized and too essential for that. But the formal guild-protected status that would have given them legal protection, regulated wages, and recognized professional identity, that never came. They continued working inside a trade they had built without the institutional armor that the men around them accumulated. And then there is Catherine Fenhill. Catherine Fenhill was a Tudor businesswoman operating in London's cloth trade in the early 16th century. A woman whose story appears in the records of the Drapers' Company, one of London's most prestigious livery companies, in ways that are alternately impressive and infuriating. The Drapers' Company controlled the trade in high-quality cloth in London. Membership was formally restricted to men, and yet Catherine Fenhill operated in the cloth market with an effectiveness and a visibility that the company's records simply could not ignore. She appears in those records as a trading partner, as a creditor, as a counterparty in transactions of real scale. She built relationships within the trade on the strength of her knowledge, her reliability, and her financial resources, all of which she had accumulated through years of careful work that the guild's formal rules said she should not be doing. She was never officially admitted to the Drapers' Company. That door was closed, but she operated in the spaces around it with such consistent competence that the men inside the guild had in practice to treat her as a participant whether they liked it or not. Catherine Fenhill represents something I find genuinely moving about Tudor women's economic lives. She did not rage against the rules. She did not petition for formal admission. She simply kept working, kept building, kept accumulating expertise in capital and commercial relationships until her presence in the trade was a fact that the official record could not entirely erase, even if it never quite acknowledged her fully. Now, I want to ask you something, and I mean this is a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Do you know anyone like that? Someone who has built something real inside a system that was not designed to include them, who has accumulated genuine expertise and genuine results, whose contributions are visible in the work, even when they are not visible in the official account of who did it. I ask because I think this is the pattern that keeps repeating across the history we've been tracing together. Not the dramatic confrontation, not the public rebellion, but the patient, determined construction of a real presence inside a system that keeps moving the official recognition just slightly out of reach. Let me tell you one more story because I cannot leave this part of our journey without it. Isabella Whitney. In 1567, the 9th year of Elizabeth I's reign, a woman published a collection of poems in London, not anonymously, not under a male pseudonym, under her own name, Isabella Whitney, a gentlewoman of no particular wealth or noble connection, who'd been employed as a domestic servant after her family fell on difficult times, and who had decided on the basis of what motivation exactly. We can only speculate to write verse and sell it. The collection was called A Copy of a Letter, and it was later followed by a second publication in 1573 called A Sweet Nosegay. In these poems, Whitney did something that no English woman had done in print. Before her, She wrote about her own experience as a working woman in London with a directness and a dry humor that feels across the 4.5 centuries between her and us entirely alive. She wrote about being out of service, unemployed in modern terms, and watching her siblings depart to better situations while she remained in the city. She wrote about the commercial life of London with an insider's eye. The specific streets, the specific trades, the specific rhythm of a city that was simultaneously full of opportunity and full of ways to be ground down by it. Her most famous poem, A Will and Testament, imagines her leaving London, and instead of possessions, she bequeaths to the city its own features, to Cheapside its merchants, to Smithfield its livestock market, to the Thames its waters. It is a tour of the real working commercial city of Tudor, London, written by a woman who had moved through it as a laborer and who wrote about it with the authority of someone who knew it from the inside. Isabella Whitney was not a duchess or a courtier or a woman of exceptional birth who found her way to learning despite the odds. She was a working woman who wrote and published and put her name on it. She earned money from the sales, small amounts probably, but hers under her own name for work that she had made in Tudor England. That was not a small thing. It was in its quiet way the same thing that the Aloyves had been doing with their brewing licenses, and Catherine Finkel had been doing with her cloth transactions, and the Silk Women had been doing with their parliamentary petition. It was a woman building something real in the cracks of a world that kept telling her the building was not her job. Now, across these 11 parts, we've traveled through births and educations and marriages and childbirth chambers and legal codes and reputations and courts and churches and economies and queens. We have met women who bent rules, broke them quietly, worked around them patiently, and occasionally at great cost defied them entirely. And the question that has been quietly accumulating all this time, the one I promised to address, is the one that I think is the real reason this. History still matters. What does it mean? Not just as history, not just as the story of people who lived 500 years ago in a country that may feel very far from wherever you're sitting right now, but as a mirror has a way of understanding something about the distance and the sometimes unsettling lack of distance between the world they navigated and the one we inhabit today. That is the territory of the final part of our journey, and I want to take it carefully and honestly and with all the nuance it deserves. And it is the one I've been building toward all along. We've been traveling together for a long time tonight, through birth rooms and school rooms and marriage negotiations, through sealed lying in chambers and ecclesiastical courts, and the gilded watchful corridors of royal palaces, through breweries and silk workshops, and the one small room where a woman named Isabella Whitney sat down and wrote her name on something she had made. And I want to begin this final part with a question that I have been saving for exactly this moment. What are all those rules actually for? Not the individual rules, not the specific prohibition against a married woman owning property, or the expectation that a Tudor girl perform modesty, or the requirement that a woman be churched before she could fully rejoin her community. Those we've examined one by one with some care. I mean the whole system, the entire interlocking architecture of unwritten expectations that shaped every Tudor woman's life from the moment she drew her first breath to the moment she drew her last. What was it protecting? What was it afraid of? 'Cause here is the thing about systems of control. They are never built without a reason. And the reason is almost always something that the people doing the controlling find genuinely threatening. So what did Tudor society find threatening about women? The honest answer when you look at the evidence, not the official statements, not the sermons and the conduct books, but the actual shape of the rules themselves. The honest answer is productivity, capability. The demonstrated fact visible in every generation that women who were given access to education, to economic resources, to legal standing, to the tools of intellectual and social life, those women produced things, built things, managed things, often with a competence that was inconvenient to a social order that had organized itself around the assumption of their incapacity. The rules were not primarily about women being weak. If Tudor society had genuinely believed women were weak, genuinely incapable, genuinely limited, genuinely requiring management for their own protection, it would not have needed to work so hard. You do not build elaborate legal structures to contain something that presents no threat. The rules were about channeling capability that clearly existed in the forms that serve the existing order rather than potentially disrupting it. And here is where I want to be careful, because I do not want to deliver the comforting version of this history. The comforting version says the rules were wrong. The women who resisted them were heroes, and progress has taken us to a better place. End of story. Feel good about how far we have come. I believe all of those things, but I do not think they constitute the end of the story, because the rules did not end with the Tudor period. And understanding how they lasted, how long they lasted, how deep they ran is, I think, the most important part of this entire journey. Let us talk about cover. We spent time with coverture in part 5. That legal doctrine that absorbed a married woman's identity into her husband's, stripping her of independent property rights, the ability to sign contracts to sue to own. We placed it in the Tudor period. We talked about it as a feature of a world 500 years ago. But cover was not abolished in England in the Tudor period. It was not abolished in the Stuart period, or the Georgian period, or the Regency period, or the early Victorian period. The Married Women's Property Act, the legislation that finally gave married women in England the legal right to own property in their own names, was passed in 1882. 1882, 350 years after the Tudor courts were applying cover to women like Catherine Finkel and the widows of the Goldsmiths Company. 350 years of accumulated women's lives shaped by a legal structure whose Tudor-era logic had simply kept running, kept operating, kept defining the boundaries of what married women could own and do and be in the eyes of the law, and women in England did not get the right to vote until 1918, on the same terms as men, not until 1928. I am not saying this to generate outrage. I am saying it because I think the timeline matters for understanding what we are actually looking at when we look at Tudor women's lives. We're not looking at a distant aberration. We're looking at the deep roots of a structure that extended in its formal legal and political dimensions into living memory. There are people alive today whose grandmothers were born before women in England could vote. The distance is shorter than the centuries suggest. Now, here's the question that I think about most honestly and most uncomfortably when I sit with all of this history. We're the unwritten rules of our own time, not the laws. Not the formal codified regulations that we can point to and debate and vote on. The unwritten ones, the ones that operate in the way the Tudor rules, operated not through explicit force, but through the accumulated weight of expectation, the quiet pressure of what is normal, the subtle and pervasive shaping of what feels possible and what feels transgressive and what feels like it simply is not done. I'm not going to tell you what those rules are. That is not my job, and honestly, it is not something that can be decided by one person telling another what to think. But I will say this, the fact that they are harder to name does not mean they are less powerful. It may mean they are more powerful. The unwritten rules of Tudor England were difficult to challenge in part because they were not written down anywhere to be challenged. They lived in the air, in the assumptions, in the thousand small daily signals about what a woman was for. Every generation has those signals. They change shape. They do not disappear. What I think this history offers us, and why I believe it matters beyond the purely academic, is a kind of training in noticing. The more carefully you look at Tudor England, the more skilled you become at identifying the gap between the official story and the operational reality, at asking who benefits from this arrangement, who is being told their limitations are natural when they are actually constructed, what has been labeled weakness that is actually a form of containment. Those are not comfortable questions to apply to any era, including our own, but they're the right questions. They are the ones that the historical record, when you read it, honestly insists on. Let me tell you about the women I keep thinking about. Not the famous ones. Not Margaret Bowett, or Catherine of Aragon, or Elizabeth I, or an Askew. I have enormous respect for all of them, and their stories deserve every word we've given them tonight. But the women I keep thinking about are the ones whose names I do not know. The alewife in a market town in 1520 who brewed ale that her neighbors depended on, whose name appears in a licensing record as a single line of Clark's handwriting, and who has gone from the formal record entirely within a generation, as the guild structure pushed her out. The woman who attended the births in her village for 30 years, who knew more about the practical reality of childbirth than any university-trained physician of her era, whose knowledge lived entirely in her hands and her memory, and died with her unrecorded. The girl who was 12 years old when her family arranged her first marriage, who did not have the words to articulate what was being done to her because the words had not been invented yet, who spent the next 40 years managing a household with a competence that everyone around her took entirely for granted. The lady in waiting who kept a secret for 20 years because keeping it was the only way to survive, and who took it with her when she died, and whose silence meant that someone else's life continued when it might not have. These women do not have biographies. They do not have collected letters or portraits or houses bearing their initials. They have, in most cases, only the faintest trace in records that were kept for other purposes. A name in a court document, a line in a guild register, the mention of a bequest in a will. But they were there in their millions across the 118 years of the Tudor dynasty, living the unwritten rules, in the full texture of daily experience, navigating the system, finding the cracks, choosing in the small ways available to them who to be inside the constraints they had been handed. And they left something behind, not in the ways that the history books track inheritance, not land or titles or documented legacies, something subtler and more durable. They left the template of survival. Every generation of women who came after them inherited something from how they had managed the accumulated wisdom of how to work within a difficult system, how to protect yourself and the people you loved, how to find the legal mechanisms that offered some purchase, how to build networks that provided support when the official structures offered none, how to hold your ground without making it look like holding your ground. All of that was passed forward in the way that practical knowledge always travels through demonstration and example and the quiet authority of someone who's been through something and come out the other side. That is not a small legacy. In some ways, it is the most important legacy of all because it is the one that kept people alive and moving forward in the years between the formal victories, the years when the law had not yet caught up and would not for a long time. And yet life continued, and women continued inside it with whatever resources they had. I want to close tonight with something that has stayed with me since I first read it. In the records of the Tudor church courts, those same courts where women brought defamation cases, where they sought separations, where the official apparatus of religious and social regulation was administered. There are scattered among the formal proceedings accounts of women who came to court not because they had been wronged and not because they faced punishment, but because they wanted to speak, to give testimony, to set the record straight about something that had happened to them or around them, to put their version of events into the formal, documented, preserved record, in a world that told them their voices did not carry the weight of men's voices, in a system that offered them no political representation and no formal platform. These women came to the court, and they spoke, and the clerk wrote it down, and it survived. 500 years later, historians read those depositions and hear those voices. Women who died centuries before any of us were born, who lived in a world almost unrecognizable, in its material conditions and its social structures, speaking in their own words about what they saw and what they experienced and what they believed to be true. There is something about that continuity that I find genuinely moving. The fact that the act of speaking, of insisting that your experience be recorded, of refusing to let your version of events be entirely absorbed into someone else's narrative, that act has an endurance that outlasts everything else. The rules that confine them are gone, or they have changed their form. The structures that define their limits have been rebuilt and rebuilt again. But the words those women spoke, the testimony they gave, the record they insisted on creating, that is still there. That is still there. We have traveled through 12 parts of this story together, and I want to thank you for staying with it. Genuinely, the history we have covered tonight is not the easiest kind. It does not offer simple villains or uncomplicated heroes. It asks you to hold complexity and to sit with discomfort and to keep asking questions rather than accepting tidy answers. That is exactly what good history should do. And if there is one thing I hope you carry out of this particular story, out of all the rooms we have stood in, all the women we have spent time with, all the rules we have examined, it is this. The rules that shape our lives are not inevitable. They were built. They were built by people in specific historical moments for specific reasons, and they have been rebuilt and revised, and sometimes dismantled by other people in other moments ever since. The distance between what feels natural and what is actually constructed is sometimes very small, and learning to see that distance, learning to ask who wrote the rules that feel like nature, is one of the most useful things history can teach us. Tudor women knew this in their bones, even when they did not have a language for it. They navigated it every day. The least we can do is remember them clearly. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. It genuinely means everything that you were here for the whole journey from that cold birth in part 1 all the way to here. If this story moved you, if it made you think about something differently, if it gave you a name or a moment or a detail that you will carry forward, please do leave a comment below. Tell me which woman's story stayed with you the most. Tell me which part surprised you. I read everything, and those conversations are truly the best part doing this. And if you have not yet subscribed, this is the moment. Every story I tell is built with this same care, this same depth, this same commitment to finding the human truth inside the historical record. There is so much more waiting because the next story I have for you, the one already taking shape, is another chapter of history that the official record never quite told correctly. Another set of lives lived in the margins of the world that everyone else was documenting. Another room full of women who are doing something extraordinary and have been waiting for a very long time for someone to finally sit down and listen. I will see you there. Sleep well tonight and dream of something worth remembering.